The city at night holds a different kind of silence, not the quiet of empty streets, but the hum of things unseen, the murmur of transactions conducted in shadows, the gentle clink of glass against glass in rooms where velvet curtains keep the world at bay. There is something almost dreamlike about the way certain eras shimmer in memory, the way the past arranges itself into scenes that feel both distant and strangely intimate, and among all those vanished worlds, few possess quite the particular texture of America in the 1920s and early 30s, when the nation conducted a grand experiment and found itself transformed in ways no one had quite predicted. The air of that time carried contradictions, the sweetness of prosperity mixed with the bitterness of restriction, the gleam of automobile headlights cutting through fog on cobblestone streets, the warmth of jazz clubs where sound seemed to pool like liquid amber, and beneath it all, threading through everything, the knowledge that certain things were forbidden, and that prohibition rarely stops desire, it merely redirects it. Picture, if you will, a coastline at dusk, waves rolling in with patient rhythm against wooden piers, and along those piers, boats rocking gently, waiting, always waiting, for darkness to deepen just a bit more, for the moment when cargo can move from ship to shore, when crates can be transferred with swift efficiency, when what is forbidden becomes possible through sheer determination and careful planning. Or imagine a city block, ordinary in daylight, buildings of brick and stone standing shoulder to shoulder, their windows reflecting clouds and passing traffic. But as evening settles, certain doorways begin to matter more than others. Certain staircases lead down rather than up, and behind unremarkable facades, entire worlds unfold, worlds of music and laughter and commerce, all existing in defiance of the law that said such things should not be. This was the landscape that emerged when the 18th Amendment was ratified in January of 1920, when the Volstead Act followed soon after, defining the specifics of enforcement, declaring that the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors would cease, that the nation would transform itself through legislative decree, that old habits would simply dissolve in the face of constitutional authority. But human nature moves by different rhythms than law, and desire finds channels the way water finds cracks in stone, persistent, patient, inevitable. The amendment did not create criminals out of whole cloth. It created opportunity, and into that opportunity stepped individuals who possessed particular talents, the ability to organize, to negotiate, to navigate between legal boundaries and public demand, to build enterprises that operated in twilight zones, visible enough to serve their customers, invisible enough to evade complete suppression. These were not the criminals of previous generations, not the lone highwaymen or small-time thieves of earlier eras. These were businessmen of a sort, albeit businessmen operating outside the traditional frameworks of commerce. They built hierarchies, established territories, created supply chains that stretched across borders and oceans. They employed accountants and lawyers, drivers and guards. They negotiated contracts and settled disputes. And yes, they used violence when they deemed it necessary. But violence was only one tool among many in their particular trade. The cities they inhabited became stages for a peculiar kind of theater. Chicago, with its lakefront and its stockyards, and its neighborhoods divided by ethnicity and ambition, New York, with its endless appetite and its layers of society stacked like sediment, Atlantic City, with its boardwalk dreams and its strategic position between metropolises, Detroit, with its factories and its border across which flowed constant exchange. Each city had its own character, its own rhythms, its own cast of figures who rose to prominence during those years when liquor became contraband and contraband became lucrative beyond measure. And the money flowed like something liquid and warm, pouring into pockets and bank accounts, financing expansions into new territories, new ventures, transforming small-time operators into powers to be reckoned with, allowing certain individuals to live with a flamboyance that seemed to mock the very idea of restraint. But beneath the surface glamour, beneath the newspaper headlines and the public fascination, there existed something more complex, a web of relationships and rivalries, of alliances formed and broken, of territories negotiated and defended, of power constantly in flux, constantly being tested, constantly requiring vigilance and strategy and the willingness to act decisively when circumstances demanded. This was the world that unfolded between 1920 and 1933, 13 years that seemed to contain entire lifetimes, 13 years during which certain names became legendary, certain events became defining moments, certain patterns emerged that would shape American culture and crime for generations to follow. And so we find ourselves standing at the threshold of this era, ready to step into its particular atmosphere, to trace the contours of its rise and eventual dissolution, to understand not just the violence and the spectacle, but the quieter mechanics, the daily operations, the human choices that accumulated into historical forces. The night deepens, the city waits, and the story begins to unfold. The roots of what would become the great criminal enterprises of the 1920s reach back further than the amendment itself, back into the immigrant neighborhoods of American cities in the late 19th century, back to communities where old world traditions met new world opportunities, where survival often meant operating outside the structures that governed more established populations, in the tenement districts of New York, in the Irish neighborhoods of Boston and Chicago, in the Italian enclaves of Lower Manhattan and South Philadelphia. Patterns were already forming, mutual aid societies that provided support when official channels were closed, neighborhood leaders who resolved disputes without involving authorities who were often hostile or indifferent, networks of trust and obligation that transcended legal frameworks. These were not criminal organizations in their inception. They were survival mechanisms, ways of maintaining order and providing assistance in communities that existed at the margins of American society. But they created structures, hierarchies of respect and influence, and when opportunity arose, these structures proved adaptable to other purposes. The Irish had arrived first in great numbers, fleeing famine in the 1840s, settling in cities where they faced discrimination and limited prospects. Many turned to politics, building machines that would dominate urban governance for generations. Others found opportunity in the saloon trade, in gambling, in the informal economies that flourished in working-class neighborhoods. By the 1880s and 90s, names like Oni Madden in New York were already emerging. Young men who understood the rhythms of street life, who could organize and protect, who commanded loyalty, through a combination of generosity and the threat of force. Madden himself arrived from England as a child, grew up in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of Manhattan's West Side, and by his teenage years was leading a gang called the Gophers, controlling territory, settling scores, establishing patterns that would serve him well when Prohibition arrived decades later. The Italians came in vast waves beginning in the 1880s, from southern regions primarily, from Sicily and Calabria and Campania, bringing with them village traditions and family structures, codes of honor and mutual obligation that had governed life in the old country for centuries. Among these traditions was the concept of omerta, the understanding that certain matters were handled within the community, that cooperation with outside authorities was a form of betrayal, and that respect flowed to those who could provide protection and resolve conflicts. In Sicily, this had manifested in various forms, sometimes as resistance to outside rulers, sometimes as simple criminality, but always with a particular organizational structure, a hierarchy based on respect and demonstrated capability, familia, groups that operated with internal codes and external ambitions. When these traditions transplanted to American soil, they adapted, evolved, took on new characteristics while maintaining certain core principles. In New Orleans, in New York, in Chicago, groups formed around regional and family ties, Sicilians from the same villages or provinces clustering together, establishing networks of trust in a foreign land. The Black Hand extortion rackets of the early 1900s represented one early manifestation, letters demanding payment, threats against those who failed to comply, a crude but effective form of taxation imposed on successful Italian merchants and businessmen who had no recourse to police protection they did not trust. But these were disorganized efforts, individual operators or small groups working independently. What would emerge later was something more structured, more ambitious, more capable of sustained operation across multiple territories and enterprises. New York in those early years was a patchwork of such operations. The Five Points Gang controlled territory in Lower Manhattan, led at various times by figures like Paolo Antonini Vaccarelli, who anglicized his name to Paul Kelly and operated with a sophistication unusual for the era. He wore tailored suits, spoke multiple languages, saw himself as a businessman rather than a mere street tough. Among those who learned under Kelly's tutelage were younger men who would become legendary in their own right. Johnny Torrio, quiet and methodical, a thinker rather than a brawler, someone who understood that organization and planning mattered more than simple muscle. Torrio watched, learned, began to see possibilities beyond the limited horizons of street gang warfare. He understood that territory could be controlled through cooperation as well as conflict, that rival groups might serve mutual interests through negotiation rather than endless cycles of retaliation. When opportunity called him to Chicago, he went, bringing with him ideas about how criminal enterprise might be organized on a larger scale, more efficiently, more profitably. Chicago in the early 20th century was a city in constant transformation, meat-packing plants and steel mills drawing workers from across the globe, neighborhoods segregated by ethnicity and class, political machines that ran on patronage and graft, and underneath the official economy, a vast informal economy of gambling, prostitution, saloons, and vice districts that operated with varying degrees of official tolerance. The levee district on the south side was particularly notorious, a concentration of brothels and gambling houses and saloons controlled by political figures like Michael Hinky Dink Kenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin, aldermen who protected the vice trade in exchange for political support and financial tribute. Into this environment came successive waves of organizers. Big Jim Colosimo established himself as a major force, starting as a street sweeper and precinct worker, moving into the management of brothels and gambling operations, eventually controlling much of the vice trade in the levee and beyond. Colosimo understood the importance of political connections. He maintained relationships with aldermen and police officials, ensured that his operations faced minimal interference, built an empire that generated enormous profits from activities that were technically illegal but functionally tolerated. When Colosimo needed someone to help manage and expand his operations, he sent for his nephew from New York, Johnny Torrio, the quiet thinker who had learned his craft in Paul Kelly's organization, who arrived in Chicago around 1909 and immediately began to see possibilities that extended beyond Colosimo's traditional focus on vice. Torrio was patient, methodical. He helped Colosimo expand into new territories, establish new operations, negotiate arrangements with other operators, and all the while he was thinking, planning, understanding that the real opportunities lay not in the traditional vice trades but in whatever came next. And then came the amendment, the Volstead Act, the sudden transformation of a legal industry into forbidden territory, and Torrio saw immediately what this meant. The entire apparatus of breweries and distilleries, of saloons and distributors, suddenly operating outside the law, suddenly vulnerable to anyone who could organize supply and distribution, suddenly offering profit margins that made traditional vice trades look almost quaint by comparison. But Colosimo, comfortable in his established routines, wealthy beyond measure from his existing operations, could not see the opportunity, could not or would not pivot to embrace this new reality. And in May of 1920, just months after Prohibition took effect, Colosimo was shot and killed in the lobby of his own restaurant, a murder that was never officially solved, but which cleared the way for Torrio to reshape the organization according to his own vision. Torrio moved quickly, establishing relationships with breweries, arranging for supply, creating distribution networks, and he brought in reinforcements from New York, including a young man he had known from the old neighborhood, someone with charisma and ambition, and a willingness to use violence when necessary. Alphonse Capone, who arrived in Chicago in 1921, not yet 22 years old, ready to help build an empire. In New York, similar transformations were occurring. Arnold Rothstein, already wealthy from gambling operations, immediately understood the potential of prohibition. He began financing shipments, arranging for imported whiskey from Canada and Europe, establishing the supply chains that would feed the speakeasies sprouting throughout the city. Rothstein was a different type entirely from the street toughs and gang leaders. He came from a respectable family, his father a successful businessman, Arnold himself educated and sophisticated. He wore fine clothes, operated from offices and restaurants rather than street corners, saw himself as a financier rather than a gangster. And in many ways, he was correct. His role was to provide capital and connections, to link suppliers with distributors, to smooth the way through political and legal obstacles, Others learned from his example. Charles Lucky Luciano, born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, arrived in New York as a child, grew up in the Lower East Side, started in small-time crime but possessed intelligence and vision that set him apart. He understood that ethnic divisions limited opportunity, that cooperation across traditional boundaries might prove more profitable than rigid adherence to old country loyalties. Meyer Lansky, born Meyer Suchovlyansky in what is now Belarus, arrived as a child, grew up on the Lower East Side alongside Luciano, formed a partnership that would last decades. Lansky possessed a gift for numbers, for organization, for seeing the mathematical structures underlying criminal enterprise. He would become the financial architect for operations that spanned the nation. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, volatile and violent, where Lansky was calm and calculating, but equally ambitious, equally willing to embrace the opportunities that Prohibition created. Together, they formed partnerships that transcended the ethnic boundaries that had previously defined criminal organization. In Detroit, the proximity to Canada created unique opportunities. The border ran through water, the Detroit River and Lake Erie, and across that border lay Ontario, where distilleries continued legal operation, producing whiskey that could be transported across water under cover of darkness. The Purple Gang emerged in Detroit, primarily Jewish, ruthless in their willingness to use violence to control territory and eliminate rivals. They handled much of the importation from Canada, controlled distribution throughout the city, and supplied operations as far away as Chicago and New York. Atlantic City, with its boardwalk and its beaches, its reputation as a resort destination became another crucial node in the network. Enoch Nucky Johnson controlled the city through a combination of political power and criminal enterprise. He was treasurer of Atlantic County, which gave him official authority, but he also controlled the flow of liquor through the city, the gambling operations, the entertainment venues. Johnson lived openly and lavishly, maintained a suite in the Ritz-Carlton, dressed impeccably, presented himself as a political boss rather than a criminal, and in the tolerant atmosphere of Atlantic City, where tourism depended on providing visitors with entertainment that was forbidden elsewhere, he operated with remarkable freedom. Each city developed its own character, its own primary figures, but increasingly these separate operations began to recognize their interdependence. That territory in one city might be protected by alliances with powers in another, that supply chains required cooperation across vast distances, that the business of prohibition was becoming national in scope, requiring coordination and communication that transcended to traditional gang structures. The early years, from 1920 through perhaps 1924 or 25, were a time of rapid expansion and frequent violence, as territories were claimed and defended, as organizations grew from neighborhood operations into citywide and regional powers, as the vast profits from bootlegging allowed for expansion into other enterprises, gambling, labor racketeering, protection schemes. The money transformed everything, allowed for political corruption on a scale previously unimaginable. Police officers and judges, aldermen and mayors, all finding themselves offered sums that made resistance difficult, and the public, thirsty and largely unsympathetic to prohibition, often celebrated the very criminals who were breaking the law to provide what they desired. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the great drama of the Prohibition era was truly beginning to unfold. The mechanics of the business itself possessed a complexity that belied its outlaw status. This was not simple criminality, but rather an intricate system of production, transportation, distribution, and retail, each stage requiring careful coordination and each vulnerability requiring protection. Consider the supply chain in its entirety, beginning perhaps in Scotland or Ireland, where legitimate distilleries produced whiskey that was legally exported, the bottles labeled for destinations in the Caribbean or South America. But the ships carrying them would slow as they approached international waters off the American coast, 12 miles out where jurisdiction became uncertain, and there they would wait. The rum rose, as these floating warehouses came to be called, stretched along the Atlantic coast, ships from a dozen nations anchored beyond the legal reach of American authorities, their holds full of genuine Scotch, Irish whiskey, French champagne, English gin, all waiting for the smaller boats that would make the actual run to shore. On moonless nights, or in fog that rolled in thick and concealing, the contact boats would venture out, fishing vessels and pleasure craft and boats designed specifically for speed and cargo capacity. They would pull alongside the larger ships, transfer their loads with practiced efficiency, and then run for the coast, running lights extinguished, engines throttling up to outpace any Coast Guard cutters that might give chase. The Coast Guard was undermanned and under-equipped, a force designed for rescue operations suddenly tasked with enforcing an unpopular law across thousands of miles of coastline. They did their best, seized shipments when they could, arrested crews, confiscated vessels, but for every boat they caught, a dozen made it through, and when the boats reached shore, the cargo moved quickly into warehouses, into the backs of trucks, into the distribution networks that fed the city's endless thirst. Each case of genuine imported spirits worth many times what it had cost at the source, the markup justified by the risk, by the bribes that had to be paid, by the infrastructure that had to be maintained. But imported liquor was only one source. Domestic production filled much of the demand, and here the operations became even more varied. Industrial alcohol diverted from legitimate purposes, denatured, and then redistilled to remove the poisons that had been added to make it undrinkable, a dangerous process that sometimes failed, sometimes left the methanol that caused blindness and death. Moonshine operations in rural areas, stills hidden in forests and hollows, producing corn whiskey and grain alcohol that was shipped to cities and either sold as is or redistilled and relabeled as something finer, the quality variable, the taste often harsh, but the demand insatiable. And then there were the breweries, the massive facilities that had produced beer legally before Prohibition, some shut down entirely, others converted to producing near beer, the legal low-alcohol beverage that satisfied almost no one, but many continued secret production, full-strength beer that moved through underground channels to speakeasies and private customers. In Chicago, Torrio and Capone controlled several breweries, the Sieben Brewery, among others, operating with the cooperation of owners who had little choice, producing thousands of barrels that were distributed throughout the city and suburbs, each keg representing profit. each delivery requiring protection from the hijackers and rival organizations. The speakeasies themselves numbered in the thousands. Estimates suggested that New York City alone had 30,000 or more, far exceeding the number of legal saloons that had existed before Prohibition. They ranged from elaborate clubs with entertainment and fine dining to simple basement operations with a few bottles and some chairs. The better establishments required passwords, a way to screen customers and maintain some pretense of selectivity. Though enforcement was often lax, the goal was plausible deniability rather than actual security. A knock at the door, a murmured phrase, and entry was granted to rooms where liquor flowed as freely as it ever had in the legal saloons of the past. Some speakeasies became legendary. The Cotton Club in Harlem, showcasing black performers for white audiences, the music extraordinary, the atmosphere charged with the thrill of transgression, the 21 Club in Manhattan, with its secret wine cellar and its elaborate system for disposing of evidence should raiders arrive, the Green Mill in Chicago, where Capone himself was a regular, maintaining a table where he could sit with his back to the wall, watching the room, enjoying the jazz that filled the air like smoke. The musicians found steady work in these establishments. Jazz flourished in the speakeasy culture, the music's improvisational nature, its sense of freedom and rebellion, perfectly suited to venues that existed outside the law. Young artists like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington found audiences and honed their craft in rooms where illegal liquor loosened inhibitions and opened wallets. The money flowing through these establishments was staggering. A successful speakeasy might gross thousands of dollars on a busy weekend night, and much of that money flowed upward to the suppliers, to the organizations that controlled territory, to the figures at the top of the hierarchies who were becoming wealthy beyond the dreams of their immigrant parents. Capone in Chicago epitomized this transformation. He moved from a simple enforcer to Torrio's right hand, and when Torrio was shot and wounded in 1925, decided to retire and leave Chicago entirely. Capone inherited an empire. He was not yet 30 years old, and he controlled bootlegging operations, gambling houses, brothels, legitimate businesses used for laundering money. He employed hundreds, paid off police and politicians, and lived with a flamboyance that made him a public figure. His headquarters at the Lexington Hotel became famous. His home in suburban Cicero, a fortress. He dressed in expensive suits, silk shirts, diamond jewelry, attended the opera and sporting events, granted interviews to newspapers, presented himself as a businessman providing a service the public wanted, and in some ways he was not wrong. The public did want what he was selling, and many saw him as a kind of Robin Hood figure, though the reality was far more complex and often brutal. The violence was never far from the surface. Territory was valuable, and challenges had to be met with overwhelming force to maintain respect and control. The north side of Chicago was controlled by Dean O'Banion, an Irishman who had started as a singing waiter and small-time thief, built his own organization, and refused to acknowledge Capone's supremacy. O'Banion operated a flower shop as a legitimate front, Schofield's, and it was there in November of 1924 that he was killed, shot multiple times by men who entered as customers. His death, ordered by Torrio and Capone, an attempt to eliminate a rival and claim his territory, but O'Banion's lieutenants Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran among them did not simply submit, they retaliated. The war that followed consumed the city for years. Ambushes and assassinations, car bombs and machine gun attacks, the violence spilling into public spaces, bystanders sometimes caught in crossfire, the city's reputation as a war zone growing with each new headline. The weapons themselves became more sophisticated. Thompson submachine guns, the Tommy gun, designed for military use but finding eager purchasers among bootleggers, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, devastating at close range, the sound distinctive and terrifying, the weapon becoming symbolic of the era itself. The St. Valentine's Day massacre in February of 1929 represented the apex of this violence. 7 men associated with Bugs Moran lined up against a garage wall and machine gunned to death. The killers dressed as police officers, the execution methodical and brutal. Newspapers across the nation carried the story, photographs of the bodies, the blood-stained wall, the public simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Capone was in Florida at the time, establishing an alibi, but few doubted who had ordered the hit. It was meant to eliminate Moran and decapitate the North Side gang, though Moran himself escaped by chance, arriving late and seeing the police car outside, assuming a raid was in progress and leaving before the killers struck. The massacre marked a turning point. The violence had become too public, too brazen, too impossible to ignore or tolerate. Public opinion began to shift. Federal authorities increased pressure, and Capone's days of operating with near impunity were numbered, though he did not yet know it. In New York, the violence took different forms, but was no less present. The Castellamarese War of the late 1920s and early 30s pitted rival Sicilian factions against each other, old country grudges transplanted to American soil, Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano leading opposing sides, dozens killed in a conflict that threatened to consume the entire Italian underworld of the city. Lucky Luciano watched this war with growing frustration. He saw it as wasteful, destructive of business, rooted in old-world thinking that had no place in American operations. He was allied with Masseria, but increasingly he looked for a way to end the conflict and establish a more stable arrangement. In April of 1931, Luciano arranged for Masseria to be killed, shot while eating lunch at a Coney Island restaurant. Luciano himself was dining with him, but conveniently stepped away just before the shooters entered, with Masseria dead. Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, but his reign lasted only months. In September of 1931, Maranzano was killed in his office, stabbed and shot by men posing as federal agents, and this time it was Luciano who emerged in control, but he did not declare himself boss of bosses. Instead, he proposed something different, a commission, a council of leaders from different organizations who would settle disputes, divide territory, coordinate activities, bring order to what had been chaos. This was the vision that Meyer Lansky had been advocating. That crime could be organized like legitimate business, with boards and agreements, with rules and consequences for breaking them, with cooperation replacing constant warfare. The commission, as it came to be established, included leaders from New York's 5 families, representatives from Chicago, from Buffalo, from other major cities. They met periodically, settled jurisdictional disputes, approved major decisions, establish the structure that would govern organized crime for decades to come. But this was happening as Prohibition itself was entering its final phase. By the early 1930s, the great experiment was clearly failing. The violence had not abated. The public health concerns had worsened. Bootleg liquor was often poisonous. Organized crime had been enriched beyond measure. Corruption had become endemic, and public opinion had shifted decisively against the amendment. The Depression had struck. The economy contracted. Unemployment soared, and suddenly the tax revenue that legal alcohol could generate became appealing. The jobs that breweries and distilleries could create seemed necessary. The arguments for prohibition weakened as economic desperation grew. The election of 1932 brought Franklin Roosevelt to power, and he had campaigned on a platform that included repeal. The process moved quickly once he took office. The 21st Amendment was proposed, sent to the states for ratification, and by December of 1933 it was complete. Prohibition was over. The great experiment had ended, and the criminal empires it had created faced an uncertain future. The end of Prohibition did not mean the end of the empires that had been built upon it, the organizations that had grown powerful and wealthy during those 13 years possessed too much momentum, too much infrastructure, too many skilled personnel to simply dissolve when liquor became legal again. But adaptation was necessary. The business model that had generated such extraordinary profits was suddenly obsolete. Breweries and distilleries could operate legally. Bars and restaurants could sell openly. The markup that had made bootlegging so lucrative evaporated overnight, and the organizations had to find new sources of revenue or face irrelevance. Some transitions were straightforward. Those who controlled speakeasies simply obtained licenses and became legitimate bar owners. Those who had managed distribution networks found work in the newly legal liquor industry, using skills and connections developed during the underground years. The line between legal and illegal operations blurring in ways that would persist for decades. But the major figures, those who had built empires, faced more complex choices, and their decisions in those transition years would shape the nature of organized crime in America for generations to come. Gambling became a primary focus. It had always been part of the portfolio, but now it moved to the center. Casinos and betting operations, numbers rackets in urban neighborhoods, slot machines placed in bars and restaurants, sports betting on baseball and boxing and horse racing, all generating steady revenue streams that could replace bootlegging profits. Meyer Lansky saw the potential early. He had already been involved in gambling operations during Prohibition, but now he expanded aggressively, establishing operations in Florida, forging connections in Cuba, where casinos catered to American tourists seeking excitement unavailable at home. He understood that gambling crossed class lines, that wealthy businessmen and working-class neighborhood residents all desired the thrill of wagering, and he built operations to serve both markets. In Las Vegas, a desert town in Nevada, where gambling was legal, visionaries began to see possibilities. Benjamin Siegel was sent west to explore opportunities. He found a sleepy outpost with a few small casinos, but he envisioned something grander, resort hotels that would attract visitors from across the nation, entertainment palaces that combined gambling with shows, and fine dining and luxury accommodations. The Flamingo Hotel which Siegel began building in the mid-1940s, represented this vision, though he would not live to see it fully realized. Killed in June of 1947 in circumstances that remain disputed, but the model he pioneered would transform Las Vegas from a dusty crossroads into an entertainment capital, and organized crime figures would control much of that development for decades. Labor racketeering expanded as another crucial revenue source. Unions represented workers in industries ranging from construction to garment manufacturing to trucking to the waterfront, and control of unions meant power over who worked and who didn't, meant the ability to call strikes or guarantee labor peace, meant opportunities for corruption through pension fund manipulation and sweetheart contracts with employers. The Teamsters Union, representing truck drivers and warehouse workers, became particularly important as the national economy increasingly depended on trucking to move goods. Control over the Teamsters meant leverage over entire industries, the ability to disrupt commerce or ensure smooth operations. And figures like Jimmy Hoffa would rise to power through alliances with organized crime figures, using their muscle to consolidate control and eliminate rivals. The waterfront in cities like New York became infamous for union corruption. The International Longshoremen's Association controlled who worked the docks, shape-ups each morning where men gathered hoping to be selected for day work, foremen choosing those who paid kickbacks or showed proper deference. The entire system riddled with theft and extortion, but also highly profitable for those in control. Narcotics trafficking emerged as another source of revenue, though this was more controversial within the organizations themselves. Some leaders saw it as too risky, too likely to bring federal attention, too morally problematic even for men who had built fortunes on illegal alcohol and gambling, but the profits were undeniable. Heroin, particularly, imported from Europe or increasingly from sources in Asia. The markup enormous. The addiction of users ensuring steady demand, and gradually more organizations became involved, despite the risks and reservations. Though this remained a smaller part of operations than gambling or labor, racketeering through the 1940s and 50s. Legitimate businesses provided both revenue and cover. Restaurants and nightclubs, construction companies, vending machine operations, laundries and dry cleaners. These generated legal income, provided employment for family members and associates, and offered opportunities to launder money from illegal activities, mixing clean and dirty funds until they became indistinguishable. The political connections established during Prohibition remained valuable, perhaps even more so, as organizations sought to operate with minimal interference. Campaign contributions to local officials, payoffs to police and prosecutors, influence over judges and city councils, all continued and in some cases expanded. The corruption that had flourished during Prohibition becoming institutionalized in some cities, but federal attention was increasing. J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had largely ignored organized crime during the Prohibition years, focusing instead on bank robbers and kidnappers, the famous criminals like John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd, who captured public imagination. But by the late 1930s and into the 40s, this began to change. The tax case against Capone had demonstrated the effectiveness of financial investigation. He had never been convicted of bootlegging or murder. The violence and corruption that made him notorious had proven difficult to prosecute. But in October of 1931, he was convicted of income tax evasion, sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, and his empire began to fracture in his absence. He had entered prison at the height of his power, wealthy and famous and feared, but syphilis, contracted years earlier and left untreated, began to destroy his mind. By the time he was released in November of 1939, he was a shell of his former self, incapable of managing anything. He retired to his Florida estate and died there in January of 1947, only 48 years old. A cautionary tale about the ultimate futility of power built on violence and corruption. The tax approach became a template, following the money, examining records, building cases on financial crimes when other charges proved difficult, and it worked against other figures as well, though many learned to be more careful, to use frontmen and complex corporate structures to keep less obvious records, to insulate themselves from direct connection to criminal proceeds. The Second World War brought its own complications and opportunities. Rationing created black markets in scarce goods, sugar and gasoline and tires and meat, all tightly controlled and all available through underground channels at inflated prices. Some organized crime figures profited handsomely from these markets, while others found themselves drafted or volunteering for military service, putting criminal careers on hold for the duration. Luciano himself, imprisoned in 1936 on compulsory prostitution, charges that many considered questionable, reportedly cooperated with naval intelligence during the war, using his connections on the New York waterfront to prevent sabotage and ensure labor peace on the docks, and later to smooth the way for the invasion of Sicily. Though the details of this cooperation remain murky and disputed, and in 1946 he was released and deported to Italy, never to return to America, though he continued to exert influence from exile. The post-war years saw consolidation and bureaucratization. The organizations that survived operated more like corporations, with hierarchies and specialization, with family structures that determined succession and authority. The spontaneous violence of the Prohibition era giving way to more calculated use of force. Disputes settled through commission mediation when possible. Violence reserved for serious violations or external threats. The Kefauver hearings in 1950 and 1951 brought organized crime into American living rooms, televised sessions featuring testimony from mobsters and their associates, the public watching as Frank Costello's hands fidgeted nervously, as witnesses invoked their Fifth Amendment rights hundreds of times, as the scope and structure of organized crime were revealed in unprecedented detail. The hearings made celebrities of some witnesses and increased public awareness, but produced limited immediate legal consequences, proving what everyone suspected was more difficult than simply exposing it, and the organizations adapted, became more cautious, more sophisticated in their operations, more careful about what was discussed and where. The Appalachian meeting in 1957 represented both the power and the vulnerability of organized crime in this era. Over 60 major figures from across the nation gathering at a rural estate in upstate New York, supposedly for a barbecue, but discovered by local police, the resulting raid scattering attendees through the woods, men in expensive suits fleeing through underbrush, the spectacle making headlines, destroying the fiction that organized crime was limited to isolated local operations. The meeting had been called to address various issues: narcotics policy, territorial disputes, leadership questions in various cities. It demonstrated the national scope of organization, the Commission's continuing role, but the exposure was devastating. Many of those identified at Appalachian faced legal consequences, and federal investigations intensified. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General in the early 1960s, making organized crime a priority, using wiretaps and informants, building cases that would eventually produce convictions. But by then the era that had begun with Prohibition was truly over. The men who had built empires on bootlegging were dying or retiring. Torrio had retired wealthy to New York, lived quietly until his death in 1957. Lansky continued operating into old age, but kept lower profiles, focusing on financial operations rather than territorial control. The flamboyance of the Capone era, replaced by corporate structures and careful discretion, the next generation took over. Men like Carlo Gambino and Sam Giancana, who had learned during Prohibition but came to power in the post-war world, operating in different contexts with different challenges, facing federal investigations that were more sophisticated and persistent, managing organizations that were more complex and geographically dispersed. And yet the patterns established during Prohibition persisted. The understanding that political corruption was essential, that violence must be controlled and calculated rather than spontaneous, that diversification across multiple revenue streams provided stability, that organization and discipline mattered more than individual bravado. All lessons learned in the crucible of the 1920s and early 30s. The cities themselves bore the marks of that era, neighborhoods where certain families maintained influence, businesses that had started as fronts during Prohibition and persisted decades later, political machines whose roots reached back to alliances forged when liquor was contraband, the legacy embedded in urban geography and social structures, and in the broader culture, the images and stories, the films and books, the mythology of the gangster as a peculiarly American figure, both admired and condemned, the self-made man who rises from poverty through intelligence and ruthlessness, who lives large and dies violently, who defies authority and pays the price. All of this traceable to Prohibition and the figures who dominated that era. The 13 years from 1920 to 1933 had created something that outlasted the circumstances that birthed it, had transformed criminal enterprise from local and limited to national and organized, had created structures and relationships and methodologies that would persist and evolve, had made certain names legendary and certain patterns permanent in American life. The deeper currents beneath these surface events reveal patterns that extend beyond simple criminality. The Prohibition Era gangsters were operating at an intersection of forces: immigration and urbanization, capitalism and regulation, tradition and modernity, and in navigating these cross-currents, they both shaped and were shaped by the America emerging around them. Consider the role of ethnicity. The organizations were built along ethnic lines initially, Irish and Italian and Jewish groups operating separately, maintaining old country loyalties and suspicions. But Prohibition created pressures that eroded these boundaries. The scope of operations required cooperation. The profits were too large to be limited by prejudice. And gradually a kind of meritocracy emerged within the criminal world. based not on ancestry, but on capability and ruthlessness. Luciano and Lansky's partnership exemplified this, a Sicilian and a Jew working together when their communities remained largely separate in legitimate society. They saw that ethnicity was less important than competence, that the old divisions served no purpose in the new context, and their success demonstrated the advantage of transcending tribal loyalties. This was a peculiar kind of Americanization, the melting pot functioning in the underworld perhaps more effectively than in legitimate society, where discrimination and prejudice still limited opportunities. The criminal organizations offered advancement based on performance, a cruel meritocracy perhaps, where failure often meant death, but a meritocracy nonetheless. The relationship between these organizations and their communities reveals another complexity. The gangsters were often seen as benefactors in immigrant neighborhoods. They provided jobs and money through parties and bought presents for children at Christmas, helped families in need when government assistance was limited or non-existent. They were neighborhood boys made good, and the fact that their success came through crime was overlooked or rationalized by people who saw legitimate society as closed to their kind. This was especially true during the Depression, when legitimate employment vanished and hunger became real. The neighborhood boss, who could provide work or money, became a figure of respect, regardless of the source of his wealth. The moral calculations shifted when survival was at stake, and the organizations exploited this, building loyalty through generosity that was real even if the motives were self-serving. The political machines of the era operated on similar principles: patronage and favors, jobs and assistance in exchange for votes and loyalty. The line between political boss and crime boss often blurred, each providing services that official government did not or could not, each building power through networks of obligation and mutual benefit. And there was a theatrical quality to the entire era, the way these figures presented themselves. Capone, with his silk suits and diamond stick pins, attending operas and prize fights, granting interviews where he portrayed himself as a businessman. The performance was part of the power. The visibility demonstrated both success and invulnerability, at least until it didn't. The public's fascination reveals something about the culture of the time. The newspapers sold more copies with gangster stories on the front page. The public devoured details of their lives and deaths. There was something compelling about these men who had risen from poverty to wealth, who defied the law and seemed to prosper, who lived with intensity and died dramatically. They embodied both the American dream and its shadow side, success through any means necessary. Individual will triumphant over social constraints. The violence itself took on ritualistic qualities. The one-way rides where victims were taken for drives they didn't return from. The use of flowers at funerals, elaborate and expensive. O'Banion, the florist, killed among his flowers. The symbolism, perhaps unconscious but potent. Beauty and death intertwined. The forms of respect maintained even in murder. The technology of the era enabled the operations while also documenting them. Automobiles allowed for rapid movement and quick escapes. The Tommy gun made small groups capable of overwhelming firepower. Telephones enabled coordination across distances. But these same technologies aided law enforcement. Cars could be traced. Phone lines could be tapped. The tools cut both ways, and increasingly the advantage shifted toward those with legal authority to use them systematically. The economics underlying everything followed a logic that was pure capitalism: supply and demand, risk and reward, monopoly and competition, the invisible hand operating in black markets as surely as in legitimate ones, perhaps more purely, since no regulations constrained the operations. The gangsters were entrepreneurs responding to market signals. The fact that their enterprise was illegal was almost incidental to the economic forces at work. And when Prohibition ended, the market corrected. The artificial scarcity that had created such profits disappeared. Prices collapsed. The business model failed. And like any business facing obsolete conditions, the organizations had to adapt or die. Most adapted, finding new markets and new methods, demonstrating a flexibility that belied the stereotype of criminals as simple thugs. The legacy in American law enforcement was profound. Prohibition had demonstrated the limits of legislating morality, the unintended consequences of criminalizing activities with broad public support. These lessons would be debated for decades in contexts ranging from drug policy to gambling to prostitution. The question of what should be legal and what should be forbidden, and what happens when law and public behavior diverge dramatically. The FBI's evolution from a small agency focused on narrow federal crimes to a powerful national police force owed much to Prohibition and its aftermath, the recognition that crime had become interstate, that local authorities were often compromised or overwhelmed, that federal resources and jurisdiction were necessary to address organized criminal enterprise. This transformation shaped American law enforcement permanently. The cultural legacy persists in ways both obvious and subtle. The films and television shows that return again and again to this era, the fascination with these figures and their world, suggests something deeper than simple entertainment, perhaps a recognition that they represented something essential about American experience, the tension between order and freedom, between community and individuality, between law and desire. And so we arrive at the end of this particular journey through time, through the cities and the nights, through the speakeasies and the breweries, through the lives of men who built empires on forbidden spirits and found that empires built on sand shift and collapse when conditions change. The era that began with such certainty, with constitutional amendments and legislative declarations, with the belief that society could be perfected through law, ended in recognition of complexity, of the limits of prohibition, of the persistence of human nature against legislative will. The men who dominated those years have long since passed. Capone in his Florida decline, Luciano in Italian exile, Lansky dying in Miami. Their empires dissolved or transformed beyond recognition, the specific operations they controlled no longer existing in the forms they knew, and yet their influence persists in structures and patterns that outlived them. The cities they inhabited have changed. Chicago and New York and Detroit transforming through successive waves of economic and social change. The neighborhoods they controlled, gentrified or abandoned or renewed. The buildings where they operated demolished or repurposed. The physical traces largely erased by time and development, but memory persists in the stories told and retold, in the tours that take visitors to sites of famous events, in the museums that preserve artifacts from the era, in the continued fascination with the time that seems both distant and strangely relevant, when the rules were different, but the forces at work remain recognizable. The questions raised by prohibition remain unresolved. What should be forbidden and what allowed? How to balance individual liberty and social order? What happens when law and culture conflict? These are not historical curiosities, but ongoing dilemmas, playing out in different contexts, but following similar patterns. And perhaps that is why this era continues to fascinate, not because it was so different from our own time, but because it illuminates persistent tensions in American life, the attraction to both order and transgression, the admiration for success regardless of means, the recognition that official narratives often diverge from lived experience. The night deepens now. The city lights that illuminated speakeasies and street corners have long since been replaced. The cars that raced through dark streets are rusting in junkyards or museums. The voices that negotiated deals and ordered deaths have fallen silent. And yet something of that era lingers in the patterns it established, in the lessons it taught, in the mythology it created. We stand at a distance now, looking back across decades, seeing shapes and patterns that those living through it could not perceive, understanding consequences they could not foresee, and perhaps finding in their stories some illumination of our own moment, our own tensions, our own contradictions. The story ends as all stories must, not with neat resolution, but with continuation in other forms, the organizations evolving into new structures, the individuals replaced by successors, the specific circumstances giving way to new contexts while underlying patterns persist. And so we let the images fade, the speakeasy doors closing, the rum runners pulling away from dark shores, the city streets emptying as dawn approaches, the era itself receding into history, becoming memory, becoming mythology, becoming the stories we tell about who we were and what we became. The silence settles now, not the silence of emptiness, but of completion. The story told, the journey taken, the exploration finished for this moment. And in that settling, in that gentle conclusion, we find ourselves returned to our own time, carrying with us perhaps some new understanding, some deeper appreciation for the complexity of human endeavor, legal and illegal alike. The final image holds a city at night, lights reflecting on water, the endless movement of urban life, and then even that fades, dissolving into darkness, into stillness, into the quiet that waits at the end of every story, patient and complete. I stand in a field under a sky that seems to stretch endlessly in all directions, the grass beneath me soft and yielding, and above, nothing but the vast open blue that has called to human hearts since the very beginning of wonder. There is something about looking upward that changes the nature of dreaming, something that makes the impossible feel suddenly within reach. And I find myself thinking about all those who came before, all those who stood in fields like this one, or on cliffsides or in meadows, and felt that same magnetic pull toward the heavens. The air is cool and gentle, carrying with it the scent of earth and growing things, and somewhere in the distance a bird crosses the sky with effortless grace, its wings catching the light, and I watch the way it moves through that invisible ocean above us, the way it belongs there, as if the sky itself were holding it aloft. For so long, for countless generations, that kind of movement belonged only to birds, to insects with their gossamer wings, to seeds carried on the wind, and humanity could only watch, could only wonder, could only imagine what it might feel like to slip free from the earth's embrace and move through that blue expanse. I think about the old stories, the myths that grew from that longing, tales of feathered cloaks and wax-sealed wings, of inventors who dreamed in wood and fabric, who sketched impossible designs by candlelight, their minds racing ahead of what their hands could build, their visions dancing just beyond the edge of what the world would allow. The breeze picks up slightly, moving through the grass in long sweeping patterns, like waves on an invisible sea, and I can almost feel the texture of those ancient dreams, the weight of all that yearning, all that careful observation of how birds bank and turn, how they ride the currents, how they make the air their home. There is a particular quality to evening light, the way it softens everything, makes the ordinary somehow luminous. And standing here now, I imagine all those forgotten moments when someone stood in similar light and thought, what if we could find a way? What if the answer were simpler than we imagined? What if we stopped trying to fly like birds and instead learned to move through air as air itself moves? The shadows are growing longer now, stretching across the field, and in this golden hour everything feels poised between what was and what might be. And I think about how every great change begins this way, in stillness, in observation, in the quiet accumulation of small understanding building upon understanding. Somewhere overhead a cloud drifts, slow and stately, and I watch its shape change almost imperceptibly, the way it holds together even as it transforms. And there is something in that, something about staying aloft, about finding the balance between weight and lift, between falling and soaring. The grass whispers around me, and I am aware suddenly of standing at a threshold, not just in this field, not just in this moment, but at the edge of a story that changed everything about how humans move through the world, a story that begins with dreamers and tinkerers, with those who refuse to accept that the sky must remain forever out of reach. I can picture them, those early pioneers, bent over drawings, testing materials, calculating angles, failing and trying again, driven by something deeper than mere ambition, something more like love. Love for the challenge, love for the beauty of flight itself, love for the sheer audacious possibility that maybe, just maybe, the thing everyone said could not be done might actually be possible. The light continues to shift, moment by moment, and the sky takes on new colors, pale golds bleeding into softer blues. And I realize that this is where it all begins, in moments like this, in the space between earth and heaven, in the quiet determination of those who looked up and refused to look away. And so the story unfolds, not all at once, but gradually, like the evening itself, like the slow, patient work of understanding how air moves, how surfaces can shape that movement, how human ingenuity might find a way to dance with physics rather than fight against it. I take a breath, and the air fills my lungs. This same substance that seemed so insubstantial, so invisible, and yet contains within it the possibility of holding us aloft, of carrying us across continents, of connecting the world in ways that would have seemed pure magic to those who first dreamed of flight. The field grows quieter still, and I stand here at the beginning, ready to trace the long arc of how we learned to fly. The story begins long before anyone succeeded, begins in the careful watching, in the centuries of human eyes turned skyward with questions that had no answers yet, And if we trace it back far enough, we find ourselves in Renaissance workshops, in the mind of a man named Leonardo, who filled page after page with sketches of wings and mechanisms, drawings that would sleep in notebooks for hundreds of years before anyone understood what he had seen. Leonardo da Vinci stood at his window in Milan, watching birds, studying the way a kestrel would hover motionless against the wind, and his hand moved across parchment, capturing angles, proportions, the complex articulation of wing joints, and he dreamed of ornithopters, of machines with flapping wings that might carry a human body aloft, though the materials of his time, the understanding of his era, could not yet bridge the gap between vision and reality. The centuries rolled forward, and others tried, inventors in France, in England, brave souls who strapped wings to their arms and leapt from towers and fell, always fell, because they were chasing the wrong dream, trying to become birds rather than understanding what birds understood. That flight is not about flapping, not really, but about shape, about the way air flows over a curved surface. By the time the 1700s arrived, by the time the Montgolfier brothers stood in their paper mill in Annonay, something had shifted. Joseph and Jacques watched smoke rising from a fire, watched how it carried embers upward, and they began to wonder, not about wings, but about containment, about trapping that rising force inside something light enough to be carried. On a June day in 1783, in the town square, they launched a sphere of linen and paper 33 feet across, and it rose, lifted by hot air, climbed to perhaps 6,000 feet, and the crowd below watched in amazement as this impossible object defied everything. They thought they knew about what must fall and what could float. That same year, just months later, a hydrogen balloon rose over Paris, designed by Jacques Charles, and this one carried a man, Pilatre de Rosier, who became the first human to experience sustained flight, rising above the city, looking down at streets transformed into ribbons, at buildings become toys, at a world remade by altitude. And for 25 minutes he hung there between earth and sky, and everything changed. But balloons, for all their wonder, were prisoners of the wind. They could go up, they could descend, but they went where the air took them, and the dreamers wanted more, wanted control, wanted to choose their direction, their destination. The 1800s brought new urgency, new materials, new understanding of air as something that could be measured, calculated, predicted. And in England, a man named George Cayley began to think differently about the whole problem, began to see that flight required three separate things working together: lift, thrust, and control. Cayley built gliders, tested them on the hills near his estate, and in 1804 he achieved something remarkable, a model glider that could sustain itself, could maintain altitude, could demonstrate that fixed wings that did not flap, could hold something aloft if they were shaped correctly, if they met the air at the right angle. He understood what others had missed, that a curved wing, an airfoil, creates different pressures above and below, that air moving faster over the top creates a kind of suction, a lifting force, and this understanding, this insight, was the key that would eventually unlock powered flight, though Cayley himself would not live to see it realized. Across decades, across continents, others picked up the thread. Otto Lilienthal in Germany became obsessed with gliding, with the pure experience of hanging in air, and he built glider after glider, more than 18 different designs, and he flew them, launching himself from hills, feeling the wind hold him, learning in his body what could only partially be understood in diagrams. Lilienthal made more than 2,000 flights, and he documented everything, published tables of lift coefficients, described the sensation of controlling a glider with shifts of body weight, and people began to read his work, began to understand that flight was not some distant dream, but a solvable problem, a series of challenges that patience and experimentation might overcome. In 1896, on a Sunday afternoon in August, Lilienthal launched from his usual hill, and something went wrong. A gust caught him, the glider stalled, and he fell. And the next day he died from his injuries, but his last words carried forward. Sacrifices must be made, and they echoed in the minds of everyone who came after. Two of those who studied Lilienthal's work were brothers, Wilbur and Orville Wright, who ran a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, and they read everything they could find about flying machine, devoured Lilienthal's tables, studied Cayley's principles, and they began to see gaps, places where the existing knowledge was incomplete or wrong. The Wright brothers were methodical, patient, and they understood something crucial, that the problem of flight was really three problems, and you had to solve all three. You needed wings that could generate lift. You needed a way to move forward through the air. And you needed a method of control, of steering, of maintaining balance in 3 dimensions. They started with gliders, built their first one in 1900, and they needed a place to test it, somewhere with steady winds, with soft landings, and they wrote to the Weather Bureau, studied climate data, and chose a thin strip of sand on the North Carolina coast, a place called Kitty Hawk, where the wind came frosty, reliable and strong off the ocean. That first glider mostly flew as a kite, tethered, tested, and it taught them that the published tables they had relied on, the data from Lilienthal and others, were wrong. The lift coefficients were incorrect, and this meant they would have to start over, would have to generate their own data, their own understanding. Back in Dayton, in the room behind their bicycle shop, they built a wind tunnel, a wooden box 6 feet long with a fan at one end, and they crafted tiny model wings, more than 200 different shapes, and tested each one, measured the forces, recorded the results, and slowly, painstakingly, they built up a new foundation of knowledge that was accurate, that was theirs. Their second glider in 1901 was larger, and it revealed new problems, issues with control, with stability, and they realized that the tail needed to be movable. That control required the ability to adjust not just the wings, but the rear surfaces, to coordinate movements, to think of the aircraft as a unified system. By 1902, they had refined their design, had added a movable rudder, had developed a system they called wing warping, where wires could twist the wingtips, change their angle to the air, and this gave them the control they needed, the ability to bank, to turn, to recover from disturbances. But gliding was not enough. Gliding was falling slowly, with style perhaps, but still dependent on hills, on gravity, and they wanted true flight, wanted to go where they chose, and that meant power, meant an engine light enough and strong enough to pull them through the air. They asked engine manufacturers, sent specifications, and everyone said it could not be done. Could not build an engine with the power-to-weight ratio they needed, so they built it themselves. They and their mechanic, Charlie Taylor, crafted an engine from scratch, 4 cylinders, 12 horsepower, weighing just over 150 pounds, and it was crude, basic, but it was enough. And they designed propellers, not just any propellers, but propellers understood as rotating wings, as airfoils that pushed against the air. And they calculated the pitch, the shape, working from first principles, because no one had done this before. No one had tried to optimize thrust for an aircraft that would fly horizontally through the air. By December of 1903, everything was ready. The glider design proven, the engine tested, the propellers carved and balanced, and they returned to Kitty Hawk, to that windswept beach, set up their camp, assembled their machine, and waited for conditions to be right. On the 14th, they tried, won the coin toss that would determine who flew first, but the machine lifted too quickly, stalled, fell back, damaged the frame, and they spent days repairing it, adjusting, preparing to try again. December 17th dawned cold, wind at 27 miles per hour, and they set up on level ground this time, laid a wooden rail, a track for the machine to roll along until it achieved flight speed, and Orville climbed into position, lying prone on the lower wing, hand on the control lever. The engine coughed to life. The propellers spun, and at 10:35 in the morning, with Wilbur running alongside, steadying the wing, the machine lifted, rose from the rail, flew under its own power for 12 seconds, covered 120 feet, and when it settled back to Earth, everything had changed. They flew 3 more times that day, each flight longer than the last, and on the 4th attempt, Wilbur stayed aloft for 59 seconds, traveled 852 feet, and it was unmistakable now, undeniable. This was controlled, sustained, powered flight. The age of aviation had begun, though the world did not know it yet, did not quite believe, would take years to fully understand what had happened on that beach in that cold December wind, when 2 bicycle mechanics achieved what emperors and philosophers had only dreamed of. The newspapers were skeptical, dismissed the reports as exaggeration, as the fevered claims of provincial tinkerers. And even when the brothers offered to demonstrate their machine to the United States government, to the military, the letters were ignored, filed away, considered too fantastical to warrant serious attention. But the Wright brothers were not deterred. They returned to Dayton to a field called Huffman Prairie, 8 miles outside the city, and there they continued to fly, to refine, to push the boundaries of what their machine could do. And by 1905, they were staying aloft for more than half an hour, flying circles, figure eights, demonstrating a level of control that made it clear this was no accident, no lucky fluke. Word began to spread, not through official channels, but through whispers, through the accounts of farmers who had seen the strange machine circling overhead. And slowly, reluctantly, the world began to pay attention, began to understand that the age of the airship and the balloon was giving way to something entirely new. In France, in those early years of the 1900s, aviation enthusiasts were pursuing their own dreams. Alberto Santos Dumont, a Brazilian living in Paris, was building aircraft of his own design, And in October of 1906, he flew his 14Bs in front of a crowd, covered 220 feet, and Paris erupted in celebration, convinced that Santos Dumont had achieved the first true flight, because they had not believed the American claims, had not seen the Wright brothers fly. The rivalry spurred innovations, pushed designers to test new configurations, new approaches, and across Europe, workshops filled with the sound of engines being tuned, of fabric being stretched over frames, of propellers being carved and balanced, and each month brought news of longer flights, higher altitudes, new records set and broken. By 1908, the Wright brothers finally demonstrated their machine publicly. Wilbur flew in France, at Le Mans, and the European aviators who had doubted, who had dismissed the American claims, watched in stunned silence as he circled the field with a grace and control their machines could not match, banking smoothly, turning with precision, and they understood immediately that the Wrights were years ahead, that they had solved problems the Europeans were still struggling with. The demonstrations changed everything, sparked what historians would later call aviation fever, a sudden explosion of interest and investment, and within months there were aviation meets, competitions with prize money, crowds gathering to watch these fragile machines lift into the air, and every successful flight pushed the dream further, made the impossible more ordinary. In 1909, Louis Blériot crossed the English Channel, flew from France to England in 37 minutes, and this simple journey, this brief hop over water, shattered the psychological barrier that had made Britain feel separate, protected by the sea, and military strategists across Europe suddenly understood that aircraft were not toys, not curiosities, but weapons, tools that could change the nature of war itself. The aircraft of those early years were terrifyingly fragile. Frames of wood and wire, wings covered in fabric doped with lacquer, engines that sputtered and failed, and pilots flew without parachutes, without instruments, navigating by landmarks, by the feel of wind on their faces, and the mortality rate was staggering. Almost every pioneer of those years knew someone who had died in a crash, who had misjudged an approach or suffered an engine failure or been caught by unexpected wind. But still they flew, driven by something beyond reason, by the sheer intoxicating freedom of it, the way the world transformed from above, the way roads became lines and cities became patterns, the way altitude changed perspective, made human concerns seem small and temporary. Glenn Curtiss in America developed his own designs, created the first practical seaplane, an aircraft that could land on water, take off from harbors, and this opened new possibilities, new routes, new ways of thinking about where aircraft could go and what they could do. By 1910, there were air shows drawing crowds of thousands, pilots performing stunts, loops and rolls, flying upside down, pushing the machines to their limits, and some of these pilots became celebrities, their names in newspapers, their photographs sold as postcards. Harriet Quimby, the first American woman to earn a pilot's license, Bessica Raish, who built and flew her own aircraft, these pioneers proving that the sky belonged to anyone with courage and skill. The Great War came in 1914, and aviation was still in its infancy. The first military aircraft were used for reconnaissance, for observation, pilots flying over enemy lines, sketching troop positions, reporting back. And at first, when two aircraft met in the air, the pilots would wave, sometimes even greet each other, because they were part of a small fraternity, a community of those who understood what it meant to fly. But war has its own logic, its own momentum, and soon the observers began carrying pistols, rifles, trying to shoot at enemy aircraft, and then machine guns were mounted, first firing through gaps in the propeller arc, and then, in 1915, a Dutchman named Anthony Fokker developed an interrupter gear, a mechanism that synchronized the gun with the propeller, allowed bullets to fire between the spinning blades, and suddenly aircraft became hunters, became weapons in the sky. The fighter plane was born from this single-seat aircraft built for speed and maneuverability, and pilots who excelled at aerial combat became known as aces, men like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, who painted his aircraft bright crimson, who shot down 80 Allied planes, became a legend even to his enemies. And on the other side, Eddie Rickenbacker, René Fonck, pilots who developed tactics, learned to dive out of the sun, to coordinate attacks, to think in 3 dimensions. Aircraft evolved rapidly under the pressure of war. Engines became more powerful, more reliable. Designs shifted from wood and fabric to include metal components, and by 1918 there were aircraft that could reach speeds of 130 miles per hour, could climb to 20,000 feet, could carry bombs and cameras and wireless radios. The war ended, and the world was left with thousands of trained pilots, hundreds of surplus aircraft, and a new question: what to do with aviation in peacetime, how to take this technology born from conflict and reshape it for connection, for commerce, for bringing the world closer together. Airmail service began almost immediately. Pilots flying routes between cities, carrying letters and packages, and these flights were dangerous, flown without instruments through weather, through fog and rain and snow, and many pilots died, crashed into mountains obscured by cloud, ran out of fuel searching for landing fields, but the service continued because it proved something important, proved that aircraft could be useful, could serve a purpose beyond spectacle or war. In 1919, 2 British pilots, John Alcock and Arthur Brown, flew a modified bomber across the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Ireland, 16 hours through storm and ice, their windscreen cracking, their instruments failing, navigating by stars glimpsed through breaks in cloud, and when they landed in an Irish bog, when they climbed from their aircraft exhausted and half frozen, they had proven that the ocean was no longer an insurmountable barrier. The 1920s brought a new era, an age of aviation pioneers pushing boundaries, testing limits. Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic solo in 1927, 33 hours alone in the spirit of St. Louis. No radio, no parachute, just dead reckoning and determination. And when he landed at Le Bourget Field in Paris, 100,000 people rushed the runway, overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of what he had accomplished. Amelia Earhart followed, first woman to fly across the Atlantic as a passenger in 1928, then solo in 1932, and she became more than a pilot, became a symbol, proof that aviation belonged to everyone, that the sky recognized no gender, and she pushed further, flew from Hawaii to California, from Mexico to New York, set records, and then broke them until that final flight in 1937 when she disappeared over the Pacific, searching for a tiny island in an endless ocean. Commercial aviation began to emerge, airlines forming to carry passengers, Pan American Airways, Imperial Airways, KLM. And the aircraft evolved to meet this new purpose, became larger, more comfortable. The Ford Trimotor, the Douglas DC-3, planes that could carry 20 or 30 passengers in relative comfort, that had enclosed cabins, that made flying accessible to those who were not adventurers or daredevils. By the 1930s, air travel was becoming routine, not common yet, not affordable for most, but established, expected, and routes were spreading across continents, across oceans, flying boats, massive seaplanes like the Pan Am Clippers, landing in harbors, refueling at island bases, connecting America to Europe, to Asia, to places that had seemed impossibly distant just decades before, and all the while the technology advanced. Engines became radial, then inline. Superchargers allowed flight at higher altitudes. Retractable landing gear reduced drag. All metal construction replaced wood and fabric, and each innovation built on the last created new possibilities, new challenges to overcome. The military watched these developments, understood that the next war, if it came, would be fought in 3 dimensions, and they invested in bombers, in fighters, in aircraft that could carry tons of explosives, that could fly faster than sound seemed to allow, and designers like R.J. Mitchell in Britain created the Spitfire, a fighter so beautiful it seemed to embody flight itself, all curves and purpose. And in America, in Germany, in Russia, engineers were solving the same problems, creating machines that would soon fill the skies in terrible numbers. The Second World War arrived in 1939, and aviation became central to everything, to strategy, to survival, to the outcome of battles fought across continents and oceans, and the pace of innovation accelerated beyond anything seen before, driven by necessity, by the knowledge that superiority in the air could determine who lived and who perished. Britain stood alone in 1940, facing the Luftwaffe, facing waves of German bombers escorted by fighters, and the Battle of Britain was fought entirely in the sky, Spitfires and Hurricanes rising to meet the threat. Young pilots, many barely out of their teens, climbing into cockpits knowing the odds, knowing that each sortie might be their last, and they flew anyway, day after day, until the German offensive faltered, until the threat of invasion receded. The war pushed aircraft to new extremes. Bombers grew massive, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Lancaster, aircraft that could carry thousands of pounds of explosives across enemy territory, that flew in formations of hundreds, darkening the sky. And the crews who flew these missions, 10 men packed into each bomber, faced flak and fighters, faced temperatures far below zero at altitude, and many did not return, fell from the sky over Germany, over the Pacific. Their sacrifice measured in the slow liberation of occupied lands. In the Pacific theater, aircraft carriers became floating air bases, and the war was fought across vast distances of ocean. American Corsairs and Hellcats facing Japanese Zeros, and the nature of aerial combat evolved, became about energy management, about teamwork, about using altitude and speed to overcome an enemy's maneuverability. And pilots learned these lessons in combat. Those who survived, those who returned to teach the next wave, and then, in the final years of the war, came the jets, the Me-262, Germany's desperate attempt to regain air superiority, an aircraft without propellers, powered by turbines, capable of speeds that left conventional fighters behind. And though it came too late to change the outcome, it announced the future, showed that propeller-driven aircraft had reached their limits, that the next era would belong to jet propulsion. The war ended in 1945, and once again the world was transformed. Aviation had proven itself essential, had shown that distance was no longer protection, that oceans could be crossed in hours, that the globe was smaller than anyone had imagined, and the technology developed for war, the long-range bombers, the powerful engines, the navigation systems, all of this could be repurposed, could serve peace. Commercial aviation exploded in the post-war years. Airlines bought surplus military transports, converted bombers into passenger planes, and new designs emerged: the Lockheed Constellation, the Douglas DC-6, aircraft with pressurized cabins that could fly above the weather, that made air travel comfortable, almost routine, and the number of passengers grew exponentially, hundreds of thousands, then millions, air travel becoming not a luxury, but an expectation, a normal part of modern life. The jet age arrived commercially in 1952, the de Havilland Comet, sleek and fast, cutting flight times in half, and passengers marveled at the smooth, quiet ride, at the way jets climbed quickly above turbulence, at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, though the early comets suffered catastrophic failures, metal fatigue causing the fuselage to rupture at altitude, and the fleet was grounded, redesigned, the lessons learned written in tragedy. America's answer came with the Boeing 707, introduced in 1958, an aircraft that defined the jet age, that made transatlantic flight accessible, that carried over 100 passengers in comfort at speeds that seemed impossible just years before. And Pan Am ordered them by the dozen, launched routes connecting every continent, and suddenly London was hours from New York. Tokyo was reachable in a day. The world was shrinking. The Cold War drove military aviation to new heights, literally and figuratively. Spy planes like the U-2 flying at 70,000 feet, above the reach of interceptors, photographing Soviet installations with cameras so powerful they could read license plates from the edge of space. And when one was finally shot down in 1960, when Francis Gary Powers was captured, it created an international incident proved that even the stratosphere was no sanctuary. And then came the SR-71 Blackbird, an aircraft so advanced it seemed alien, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3, over 2,000 miles per hour, flying so high and fast that missiles could not catch it, its titanium skin heating to 600 degrees from friction with the thin air, and it flew reconnaissance missions for decades, retired finally in 1998, still the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft ever built. Commercial aviation continued its evolution. Aircraft grew larger. The Boeing 747 arrived in 1970, a wide-body jet with two aisles capable of carrying over 400 passengers, and it transformed international travel, made it economical, made it possible for ordinary people to cross oceans, to visit distant relatives, to experience cultures that had existed only in books and photographs. The Concorde flew in 1976, a supersonic passenger jet cruising at Mach 2, cutting the Atlantic crossing to under 4 hours. And there was something beautiful about it, the delta wing, the drooping nose, the sheer audacity of making supersonic travel routine. Though it was expensive, exclusive, a technological marvel that served the few rather than the many, and it flew for 27 years before retiring, a footnote to an era, a reminder that faster is not always better. The late 20th century brought refinement rather than revolution. Aircraft became more efficient, more reliable. Composite materials replaced aluminum. Fly-by-wire systems replaced mechanical controls. Computers managed everything from navigation to fuel consumption. And flying became the safest form of transportation. Safer than driving, safer than crossing the street, the accident rate dropping year by year. As technology and training improved, Airbus challenged Boeing's dominance, introduced the A320, the A380, the latter a double-decker giant capable of carrying over 500 passengers. An aircraft so large that airports had to modify their gates to accommodate it, and the competition drove both companies to innovate, to create aircraft that burned less fuel, that flew farther, that carried more with less environmental impact. Military aviation entered the stealth era, aircraft designed to be invisible to radar. The F-117, the B-2 Spirit, shapes that seemed to defy aerodynamics, all angles and flat surfaces. And they represented a new kind of warfare, one where detection mattered more than speed, where the ability to strike unseen was worth more than the ability to outrun a pursuer. Drones emerged, unmanned aerial vehicles, first as reconnaissance platforms, then as weapons, predators and reapers, flying missions controlled by pilots thousands of miles away, sitting in air-conditioned trailers in Nevada, flying aircraft over Afghanistan. And this created new ethical questions, new considerations about warfare, about presence and absence, about what it means to fight when the fighter is not at risk. Commercial aviation became a global network. Airlines forming alliances, code sharing, making it possible to book a single ticket that would take you from a small town in America to a village in Thailand, with multiple connections, seamless transfers, luggage tracked electronically, and millions of people flying every day. The sky crisscrossed with contrails, each one marking a journey, a purpose, a connection being made. The 21st century brought new challenges: the environmental impact of aviation, the carbon emissions, the contribution to climate change, and engineers began working on solutions: more efficient engines, alternative fuels, electric aircraft for short routes. And the questions became not just how to fly, but how to fly sustainably, how to maintain this incredible connectivity without destroying the planet that made it possible. Aircraft continued to evolve. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner, built largely from composites, more fuel efficient, with larger windows, better cabin pressure, designed around passenger comfort, and the Airbus A350, a wide-body twin-engine aircraft that could fly ultra-long routes. Singapore to New York, 19 hours non-stop, redefining what distances could be covered without landing. And through all of this, through more than a century of development, the fundamental wonder remained. The miracle of something heavier than air staying aloft, of human beings crossing continents in hours, of technology that seemed impossible becoming so routine that people complained about leg room, about delays, taking for granted the sheer audacity of flight itself, The evolution from those 12 seconds at Kitty Hawk to modern aircraft carrying hundreds of passengers, thousands of miles. This transformation happened within a single human lifetime. People born before the Wright Brothers flew lived to see men walk on the moon, lived to see the sky filled with aircraft, lived to see the world connected in ways that would have seemed pure fantasy in their youth. And standing here now, in this moment of reflection, we can trace the thread, can see how each innovation built on the last, how failure taught as much as success, how the dream of flight, that ancient human longing to slip free from Earth's embrace, was finally realized not through magic or divine intervention, but through patience, through observation, through the careful application of scientific principles and human ingenuity. The story of aviation is the story of possibility, of refusing to accept limits, of looking at the impossible and asking why not. And in that story we find something profound about what it means to be human, something about our nature, our drive to explore, to connect, to transcend the boundaries that confine us. The deeper we look into flight, the more we see it as metaphor, as philosophy made tangible, because to fly is to change perspective, to see the world not as we walk through it, street by street, building by building, but as a vast interconnected whole, patterns emerging that are invisible from the ground. There is something humbling about altitude, about rising above the landscape and watching cities become clusters of light, watching mountain ranges that seemed insurmountable become wrinkles in the Earth's surface. And this shift in perspective, this ability to see the familiar made strange, has changed not just how we travel, but how we think, how we understand our place in the world. The physics of flight, when you truly consider them, remain almost magical. The idea that a curve in metal, that the simple act of moving fast enough through air creates a pressure differential sufficient to lift tons of weight and hold them aloft for hours, is still, even after more than a century, still worthy of wonder. Engineers speak of Bernoulli's principle, of Newton's third law, of the mathematics that govern lift and drag and thrust, and all of this is true, is measurable, is predictable, but there is something in the experience of flight that transcends equations, something that speaks to older dreams, older longings. Every aircraft is a compromise, a negotiation between competing forces, between the desire for speed and the need for efficiency, between strength and weight, between what we want the machine to do and what physics will allow. And in these compromises we see the art within the engineering, the creativity required to solve problems that have no perfect answer. The cockpit of a modern airliner contains hundreds of instruments, screens displaying speed and altitude and heading, systems monitoring fuel flow and engine temperature and 1,000 other variables, and yet the fundamental act remains the same as it was for the Wright brothers. You lift the nose, you feel the aircraft respond. You feel the moment when the wheels leave the ground and you transition from rolling to flying, from earthbound to airborne. Pilots speak of feeling the aircraft, of knowing through subtle vibrations and sounds when something is right or wrong. And this intuition, this connection between human and machine, persists even in an age of automation. Even when computers can land the plane more smoothly than any human hand, there remains something essential about the pilot's awareness, the human judgment that cannot quite be replicated. The history of aviation is written in both triumph and tragedy, in the names of those who succeeded and those who died trying. And we remember both. We remember Lindbergh's solo crossing, and we remember Amelia Earhart's disappearance. We remember the first moon landing made possible by aircraft technology, and we remember Challenger Columbia. The way progress sometimes demands sacrifice, we wish we did not have to make. There is a democracy in modern flight that would astound the pioneers. The idea that millions of people fly every day, that a ticket costing a few $100s can transport someone across an ocean, that flight is accessible not just to the wealthy or the adventurous, but to families on vacation, to students studying abroad, to anyone with a reason to go somewhere distant. And yet this democratization comes with loss. The loss of wonder, perhaps, the way familiarity breeds, if not contempt, then indifference. Passengers scrolling through phones while crossing the continent, complaining about Wi-Fi while traveling at 600 miles per hour, 7 miles above the earth. And maybe this is inevitable. Maybe this is what success looks like, the extraordinary becoming ordinary. But sometimes, on a clear night, when you look out the window of an aircraft and see the stars above and the lights of cities below, when you feel that subtle reminder that you are suspended between earth and space, held aloft by principles that still seem like sorcery, even when you understand the science, sometimes the wonder returns, floods back in a rush, and you remember what a miracle this is. The future of flight remains unwritten. Electric aircraft are being tested, hydrogen fuel cells explored, designs that would have seemed fantastical just years ago are being prototyped and refined. And perhaps the next century will bring changes as profound as the last. Perhaps we will look back at jet fuel and turbines the way we now look back at wood and fabric biplanes, as primitive, as the awkward first steps towards something greater. Already there are aircraft that can fly themselves, that need no pilot. And this raises questions about what flight means, about whether the human element is essential or incidental, and perhaps both answers are true. Perhaps we are building toward a future where the sky is filled with autonomous cargo carriers, with electric air taxis, with vehicles we cannot yet imagine, while also preserving a space for those who want to feel the controls, who want to experience flight not as passengers but as participants. The Wright brothers would recognize the fundamental principles in a modern aircraft, would understand lift and drag and thrust, but they would be astounded by the scale, by the millions of flights per year, by the global network that treats the atmosphere as a highway, and perhaps they would smile to know that their 12 seconds over a North Carolina beach led to this, to a world transformed, to a species that claims the sky as its domain. The light is fading now, the way it does at the end of things. And I find myself back in that field where we began, under that vast open sky, and everything has changed. Or perhaps nothing has. Perhaps the sky is still the same sky, still calling with that same ancient invitation. The story of flight is complete now, not finished, because aviation continues to evolve, continues to surprise us, but complete in the sense that we have traced the arc from dream to reality, from Leonardo's sketches to aircraft that circle the globe without landing, from human beings who could only watch birds with longing to a world where hundreds of thousands of people are aloft at any given moment. And what does it mean, this transformation, this conquest of the air? It means that distance is no longer destiny, that being born on an island or in a landlocked country does not determine the scope of your world. It means that families separated by oceans can reunite in ours, that cultures can mix and influence each other in ways that were impossible when travel meant weeks or months at sea. But it means more than convenience, more than commerce. It means that we looked at an impossible thing and made it possible, that we refused to accept the limitations that seemed absolute. And in doing so, we discovered something about ourselves, about our capacity for innovation, for persistence, for turning dreams into blueprints and blueprints into reality. The evening air is cool against my skin, and somewhere overhead, invisible in the gathering dusk, aircraft are crossing, following routes established by computers, guided by satellites, carrying people to destinations that matter to them, to weddings and funerals, to business meetings and vacations, to reunions and departures, each flight a story, each passenger a purpose. I think about that December day in 1903, about Orville lying prone on the lower wing, about Wilbur running alongside, and about that moment when the machine lifted, when it became something more than wood and fabric, when it became proof that the impossible was just the difficult waiting to be solved. And I think about all the flights since then, all the pilots who climbed into cockpits knowing the risks, all the engineers who refined and improved, all the passengers who trusted their lives to aluminum and jet fuel and the principles of aerodynamics. And the story seems less about machines and more about courage, about faith in human ingenuity, about the willingness to try even when failure seems certain. The stars are beginning to emerge. Those same stars that guided early aviators, that Lindbergh used to navigate across the Atlantic, and they seem closer somehow, more reachable. And perhaps that is what flight has given us, not just the ability to move through air, but the sense that nothing is truly beyond reach, that the universe is not a place we observe, but a place we can explore. The field is quiet now, peaceful, and the story settles into memory, into history, into the long record of human achievement, and it joins all the other stories of how we learned to do what seemed impossible, how we harnessed fire, how we crossed oceans, how we sent signals through the air, how we decoded the human genome, each achievement building on the last, each generation standing on the shoulders of those who came before. And flight, this beautiful, dangerous, impossible thing we made possible, takes its place in that progression, a reminder that we are creatures of earth who learned to move through air, who looked at birds with envy and emerged with understanding, who turned longing into science and science into reality. The darkness is almost complete now, the sky a deep blue fading to black, and the story comes to rest, comes to its natural close, the way all stories must eventually, not with fanfare or proclamation, but with a gentle settling, like an aircraft touching down after a long journey, wheels kissing the runway, the flight complete. And in this quiet ending, in this peaceful return to earth, there is satisfaction, there is wonder, there is gratitude for the dreamers and the builders, for those who believed when belief seemed foolish, who persisted when persistence seemed futile, who gave us wings. The field breathes around me, soft and dark, and somewhere distant, barely audible. The sound of an engine crosses the night sky, and I listen until it fades, until silence returns, until there is only the wind moving through grass, and the endless patient stars. There is a feeling that comes in the quiet hours when the modern world grows dim and the mind begins to wander toward older things, older questions, the kind that have no quick answers but invite contemplation instead, a slow turning over of ideas that have moved through centuries like water through stone, shaping and reshaping the way human beings understand themselves and the cosmos they inhabit. Tonight, the thoughts drift towards something called Hermeticism, a word that carries within it the weight of ancient libraries and candlelit studies, of philosophers bent over manuscripts, of seekers tracing symbols in sand and ink, trying to decode the relationship between the stars above and the soul within. The air feels different when contemplating such things, as if by merely thinking about these old traditions, something shifts in the atmosphere. Not literally, of course, but in that subtle way that happens when the mind enters a different mode of attention, a softer, more receptive state. Hermeticism is not one single thing, not one book or one teaching, but rather a river with many tributaries, each flowing from different sources, each carrying its own particular minerals and sediments, yet all mingling together into something larger, something that has nourished Western thought for more than 2,000 years. The name itself points backward to a figure both historical and mythical, Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, a curious blending of the Greek god, Hermes, and the Egyptian god, Thoth, both deities associated with writing, with wisdom, with the transmission of knowledge between worlds, between gods and mortals, between the visible and invisible. In the ancient imagination, this figure became the perfect vessel for a certain kind of knowing, the kind that cannot be found through reason alone, nor through faith alone, but through some third path, some marriage of observation and intuition, of star-watching and soul-searching. The texts attributed to this mysterious Hermes would eventually be called the Hermetica, and they would travel through time in the most unexpected ways, sometimes hidden, sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, always adapted to the needs and fears and longings of each new age that encountered them. But before exploring those journeys, there is something worth noticing about the very impulse behind Hermeticism. The fundamental question it seems to ask, which is not so much what should I believe, but rather what is the nature of the connection between all things? This is a different kind of question than the ones posed by many religions or philosophies. It does not begin with commandments or logical proofs, but with observation, with noticing patterns, with wondering why the same forms appear at different scales, why the spiral shows up in seashells and galaxies, why cycles repeat in nature and in human experience, why the microcosm seems to mirror the macrocosm. The ancient practitioners of what would come to be called Hermetic wisdom were often people who stood at thresholds, geographically and intellectually. They lived in places where cultures mixed, where Egyptian priests conversed with Greek philosophers, where Jewish mystics encountered Persian astronomers, where the trade routes carried not just spices and silk, but ideas, cosmologies, techniques for transforming consciousness and matter alike. Alexandria, in particular, becomes important to this story, a city on the Mediterranean coast where the library held scrolls from every known tradition, where scholars could spend lifetimes comparing creation, myths, and medical theories, where someone curious enough could begin to sense the deeper patterns beneath the surface differences. In such a place, in the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era, certain texts began to circulate, dialogues mostly, written as conversations between a master and a student, between Hermes and his disciples, addressing questions about the nature of God, the structure of the cosmos, the destiny of the human soul, the methods by which matter might be purified or consciousness expanded. These were not systematic treatises, not philosophical arguments in the Greek style, but something more atmospheric, more suggestive. They painted pictures with words, described visions, offered aphorisms that were meant to be contemplated rather than simply understood. One of the most famous of these texts would eventually be called the Poimandres, a title that might mean shepherd of men or knowledge of Re, depending on which linguistic thread one follows. And it describes a visionary experience in which cosmic secrets are revealed, not through deduction, but through direct perception, a kind of knowing that comes when the mind quiets enough to receive rather than construct. And this perhaps is the tone to carry forward, this sense of receiving rather than grasping, of allowing the story to unfold at its own pace, like watching stars emerge as the sky darkens, not rushing them, not demanding they appear all at once, but simply noticing, breathing, and continuing to pay attention as more and more becomes visible. The night is long, and there is much to explore, but there is no hurry. The ancient texts themselves insist on patience, on the gradual transformation that comes not from force but from sustained gentle attention. And so the opening widens, the doorway stands ready, and the journey through centuries of Hermetic thought begins to reveal itself slowly, like hieroglyphs emerging from shadow as the torch moves closer. The story properly begins not in one place but in many, because Hermeticism, as it would come to be known, emerged from a confluence, a meeting of waters that had been flowing separately for centuries: Egyptian, Greek, Persian, Jewish, each tradition carrying its own understanding of the divine, its own methods for approaching mystery. In Egypt, long before the Greeks arrived, there existed a priestly tradition centered around Thoth, the ibis-headed god who was said to have invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, magic, all the arts by which invisible realities could be made visible, by which the chaos of experience could be organized into meaning. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, the mediator, the one who weighed hearts in the afterlife and recorded the results, and temples dedicated to him became centers of learning where priests studied the movements of stars, the properties of minerals and plants, the subtle correspondences between earthly phenomena and celestial patterns. These priests understood their work as something more than what we might call science or religion. It was a unified practice, a way of reading the world as a vast text written by divine intelligence, and their goal was literacy in this cosmic language. When Alexander the Great swept through Egypt in 332 BCE, he brought with him not just armies, but the entire intellectual apparatus of a Greek culture, and after his death, when his general Ptolemy established a dynasty in Egypt, something unprecedented began to happen. The new city of Alexandria became a deliberate experiment in cultural synthesis. The Ptolemies built the famous library and museum, not merely to collect texts, but to actively encourage the translation and comparison of different wisdom traditions. Egyptian priests were invited to explain their cosmology to Greek philosophers, and Greek philosophers were invited to interpret Egyptian rituals through the lens of Platonic thought. This was the crucible, the alchemical vessel in which Hermeticism would take shape, not as a corruption of some pure Egyptian original, nor as a Greek invention merely draped in exotic imagery, but as a genuine third thing, a new form of understanding born from sustained dialogue between traditions. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus emerges from this dialogue. The Greeks already identified their god Hermes with the Egyptian Thoth. Both were psychopomps, guides of souls, both associated with boundaries and transitions, with the movement between realms, and in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Hellenistic Egypt, this identification deepened, became more than mere equation, became fusion. The epithet Trismegistus, meaning thrice greatest, may have been an intensification of an Egyptian formula, a way of saying not just great but supremely great, great in three worlds perhaps, the celestial, the terrestrial, and the underworld, or great as priest, as philosopher, as king, the traditional three aspects of Egyptian divine wisdom. Whoever first wrote under this name, and there were certainly many authors over many generations, they were creating something intentional, a voice that could speak with authority across cultural boundaries, that could address Greeks in terms they would recognize while preserving Egyptian sensibilities about the interpenetration of matter and spirit. The earliest Hermetic texts likely date from the 1st century BCE to the 3rd century CE, though dating is difficult because the texts themselves claim timeless origins. They present themselves not as innovations, but as the recovery of ancient knowledge, knowledge from before the flood, before the confusion of languages, knowledge inscribed in stone or whispered in temple sanctuaries when the world was young. This claim to antiquity was not deception exactly, but rather a different understanding of what constitutes truth. For the Hermetic authors, the validity of an idea did not depend on its novelty, but on its alignment with eternal principles. And so to say something was ancient was to say it was true, rooted in the fundamental structure of reality itself. The texts took various forms. Some were philosophical dialogues in the Greek style, exploring questions about the nature of God, the origin of the cosmos, the relationship between fate and free will. Others were technical manuals, instructions for making talismans, blending incenses, timing rituals according to astrological configurations, drawing down celestial influences into material objects. This dual nature, philosophical and practical, contemplative and operative, would remain characteristic of Hermeticism throughout its history. It was never content to be merely theoretical. It always insisted that knowledge must lead to transformation, that understanding the cosmos was inseparable from transforming oneself, from achieving what the texts called gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of the divine. One of the central philosophical texts, the Poimandres, describes a vision in which the seer's mind is lifted up and shown the process of creation, how from the infinite light of the divine mind, the cosmos emerged in stages, first as thought, then as word, then as form, and how human beings, uniquely among creatures, contain within themselves both the mortal material body and the immortal divine intellect. This teaching had profound implications. It meant that the human being was not simply a creature within the cosmos, but a microcosm, a miniature version of the whole, containing potentially all the powers and principles that govern the universe, and therefore capable through proper training and purification of accessing those powers, of becoming more fully what one already essentially is. The Hermetic path was thus presented as a kind of remembering, not learning something new, but recovering knowledge that had been forgotten, covered over by the distractions of material existence, by identification with the body and its passions. The goal was to awaken the divine intellect within, to let it rise like a spark returning to the great fire from which it came. Another important early text, the Asclepius, takes its name from the Greek god of healing, himself identified with the Egyptian Imhotep, and it presents a more elaborate cosmology, describing a hierarchy of divine beings, gods, demons, and souls, and explaining how the cosmos is held together by sympathia, sympathy or resonance, the principle that affects across any distance. This principle of sympathy would become foundational for all later Hermetic practice. It explained how astrology could work, how a plant grown under the influence of Mars might carry martial qualities, how a statue properly constructed and consecrated could become a dwelling place for a god, how the magician, by aligning himself with celestial powers, could work transformations in the material world. The Asclepius also contains one of the most striking passages in the entire Hermetic corpus, a lament for the future decline of Egypt, a prophecy that the sacred land would be abandoned, its temples empty, its gods silent, and only later, after a long darkness, would there be renewal, a restoration of the sacred order. This apocalyptic strain, this sense of living in a time of decline and hoping for restoration, runs through much of Hermetic literature, and it may reflect the actual historical experience of the communities that produced these texts. Watching traditional Egyptian religion fade under Greco-Roman influence, watching the old certainties dissolve, and seeking in these writings a way to preserve what was essential, to encode it in a form that could survive cultural collapse. The Hermetica were written in Greek, the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean, but they drew heavily on Egyptian imagery and concepts. They spoke of the Ogdoad, the group of 8 primordial gods, and the Ennead, the 9 divine principles. They referenced Egyptian cosmogonic myths, the emergence of the world from primordial waters, the separation of earth and sky, the creation of humans from the tears of the sun god. Yet they also incorporated Platonic philosophy, the theory of forms, the tripartite soul, the ascent of the mind from material illusion to intellectual truth, and they absorbed elements of Stoicism, the idea of cosmic sympathy, of logos as the rational principle pervading all things, of living in accordance with nature. And there were Jewish influences as well. The opening of the Poimandres echoes the opening of Genesis, the Spirit moving over the waters, the creation through divine speech, and some Hermetic texts seem to engage with Jewish angelology and mystical speculation about the divine name and the chariot throne described in Ezekiel. This was not eclecticism for its own sake, not a random mixing of incompatible elements, but rather a deliberate effort to find the common ground, to show that beneath the different names and narratives there was a single truth, a philosophia perennis, perennial philosophy, accessible to all who sought it sincerely. The communities that studied these texts were likely small, probably groups of initiates who met in private, who recognized each other through shared language and symbols, who transmitted teachings orally alongside the written texts, filling in gaps, explaining allegories, guiding practices that the texts only hint at. Some of these communities may have been associated with temples, particularly those dedicated to Thoth or Hermes. Others may have been more informal, circles of friends and seekers who gathered to read and discuss, to experiment with the techniques described, to share their experiences of prayer and vision and transformation. The social world of early Hermeticism remains somewhat mysterious. The texts themselves rarely describe their institutional context. They present themselves as timeless dialogues between master and student, and this very timelessness has allowed them to be adopted by many different communities across many different contexts. What is clear is that by the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, Hermetic ideas were circulating widely in the Roman Empire. They were known to Christian writers like Clement of Alexandria and Lactantius, who sometimes quoted Hermetic texts approvingly as evidence that pagan philosophy could glimpse Christian truth. And they were known to opponents of Christianity like Celsus, who used Hermetic theurgy as an example of legitimate spiritual power that did not require belief in the incarnation. The boundary between Hermeticism and early Gnosticism is porous. Both movements emphasized gnosis. Both presented elaborate cosmologies involving emanations from an ultimate divine source. Both saw material existence as a kind of exile or entrapment from which the soul must escape. Yet Hermeticism generally maintained a more positive view of the material world, seeing it not as evil but as the beautiful handiwork of a good creator, worthy of study and even reverence. The technical Hermetic texts, those dealing with astrology, alchemy, and magic, were also proliferating during this period. These were often more fragmentary, more obscure in their language, filled with recipes and rituals that assumed the reader already possessed considerable background knowledge. These operative texts describe how to create a talisman that will protect against disease, how to blend metals under specific planetary configurations to produce alloys with special properties, how to use plants and stones in healing, how to construct phylacteries inscribed with divine names, how to perform fumigations that would attract beneficial spirits or repel harmful ones. Modern readers sometimes want to separate the philosophical Hermetica from the technical Hermetica, to claim that one is sophisticated spirituality while the other is mere superstition. But this division would have made no sense to the original practitioners. For them, the philosophy and the practice were inseparable. Understanding the cosmos meant learning to work with its principles, and working with its principles required philosophical understanding of their nature and origin. The early Hermetic worldview was fundamentally animist. It saw the cosmos as alive at every level, not just plants and animals, but metals and stones, stars and planets. All possessed soul or spirit to some degree. All were capable of perception and influence, and the skilled practitioner learned to communicate with this ensouled world, to negotiate with it, to align with its rhythms, rather than fighting against them. This was a world of correspondences, where everything connected to everything else through invisible threads of sympathy, where the healer could use a plant associated with Mars to treat martial ailments, where the astrologer could read in the heavens the patterns that would manifest on Earth, where the alchemist could transform base metals into gold, not through chemical manipulation alone, but through spiritual purification that aligned earthly matter with its celestial archetype. And so the foundations were laid in those early centuries when Alexandria hummed with intellectual energy, when the library still stood, when it seemed possible that all the world's wisdom might be gathered and reconciled. Hermeticism emerged as one answer to the question of how to live in a world where multiple truths seemed to coexist, where Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion and Jewish mysticism and Persian cosmology all offered insights, but none seemed complete in isolation. The answer the Hermetic authors proposed was synthesis, not superficial mixing, but deep fusion, finding the patterns that repeated across traditions because they reflected something real, something structural about the nature of mind and cosmos. And this impulse toward synthesis, toward finding unity beneath diversity, would remain one of Hermeticism's most enduring contributions to Western thought. The centuries that followed brought both preservation and transformation. As the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, the status of Hermetic texts became increasingly precarious, yet also strangely protected by their very ambiguity. Church fathers faced a dilemma when encountering the Hermetica. On one hand, these were clearly pagan texts, products of the Egyptian mystery religions that Christianity sought to supplant. On the other hand, they spoke of a single supreme God, of the Logos or Word through which creation came into being, of the soul's immortality and its need for purification, themes that resonated deeply with Christian theology. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, quoted the Hermetic texts extensively, calling Hermes Trismegistus a prophet who had somehow glimpsed Christian truth before Christ. Augustine, too, engaged with the Hermetica, though more critically. He acknowledged their wisdom, but warned against the theurgic practices, the making of God's statues, and the invocation of demons, which he considered demonic deception. This Augustinian critique would echo through the centuries, creating a lasting tension in Christian approaches to Hermeticism. The philosophical texts could be tolerated, even celebrated as proto-Christian revelation, but the practical magical texts remained suspect, dangerous, contaminated by association with forbidden powers. As the Western Roman Empire collapsed and the classical world fragmented, much Hermetic literature was lost or scattered, but significant portions survived, particularly in the Byzantine East, where Greek remained the language of learning, and in the Islamic world where a massive translation movement was underway. The Islamic encounter with Hermeticism proved extraordinarily fruitful. Beginning in the 8th and 9th centuries, scholars in Baghdad and Cairo translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, and the Hermetica were among them. Hermes became known as Idris or as Akhnuk, identified with the prophet Enoch, a pre-Islamic sage who had received divine wisdom. Islamic philosophers and scientists engaged deeply with Hermetic cosmology. The idea of celestial influences on earthly affairs fit well with their own astrological traditions. The notion of sympathetic connections between things supported their medical theories, and the possibility of transforming base metals into gold captivated their experimental investigations. The great Islamic alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber, drew heavily on Hermetic principles. His elaborate theory of how metals were formed from sulfur and mercury in various proportions, how they could be purified and perfected, rested on Hermetic assumptions about the unity of matter and the possibility of transmutation through understanding celestial and terrestrial correspondences. Jabir's works, along with other Arabic alchemical texts, would eventually be translated into Latin, bringing Hermetic ideas back into Western Europe through a circuitous route, transformed by their passage through Islamic thought, but recognizably continuous with their Alexandrian origins. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, Hermetic manuscripts were being copied and studied in monasteries. Scholars like Michael Psellos in the 11th century wrote commentaries on the Chaldean oracles and Hermetic texts, trying to reconcile pagan theurgy with Christian theology, arguing that ancient wisdom could be purified and made safe for Christian use if properly understood. The Byzantine preservation of Greek manuscripts would prove crucial, because when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, many scholars fled westward, bringing their libraries with them. And among those precious codices were copies of the Corpus Hermeticum, the collected philosophical Hermetic dialogues. But even before the fall of Constantinople, Hermetic ideas had been filtering into medieval Western Europe through multiple channels. The Latin translations of Arabic alchemical texts, the magical handbooks like the Picatrix, which described elaborate talismanic operations based on Hermetic astrology, and the general revival of interest in ancient philosophy that characterized the 12th century Renaissance. Medieval scholars encountered a fragmented Hermeticism, bits and pieces quoted in approved Christian authorities, tantalizing references in Arabic scientific works, mysterious alchemical symbolism that seemed to promise knowledge of nature's deepest secrets. They did not yet have access to the full philosophical texts, but they knew something important existed, something that bridged the gap between faith and reason, between spirit and matter. The cathedral schools and early universities were places of ferment, where Aristotelian logic met Christian theology, where translations of Arabic science challenged traditional cosmology, where questions arose about the relationship between natural causation and divine providence, and Hermetic ideas offered one way of thinking about these problems, the notion of a world soul animating the cosmos, of nested hierarchies of being from God down through angels and celestial spheres to earthly creatures and minerals, of hidden signatures and correspondences that the wise could learn to read. All this provided a framework for understanding how God's will could be expressed through natural processes without reducing everything to blind mechanism or arbitrary miracle. Then came 1460, and everything changed, or rather, everything that had been brewing beneath the surface suddenly erupted into visibility. Cosimo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence and patron of arts and learning, acquired a Greek manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum, and he assigned its translation to Marsilio Ficino, the brilliant scholar he had recruited to revive Platonic philosophy in the West. Ficino was in the midst of translating Plato's complete works, a monumental task, but Cosimo ordered him to set Plato aside and translate the Hermetic texts first. Cosimo was old and ill. He wanted to read these ancient mysteries before he died, and there was a sense that they contained something urgent, something that could not wait. Ficino completed the translation in just a few months, working with intense concentration and the resulting Latin text, printed and distributed widely, became one of the most influential books of the Renaissance, second only to the Bible in its impact on European thought. What made the Corpus Hermeticum so electrifying was not just its content, but its perceived antiquity. Ficino and his contemporaries believed they were reading the words of an Egyptian sage who had lived in the time of Moses, or even before, a pristine source of divine revelation untouched by later corruption, a prisca theologia, ancient theology, that had been the root from which Greek philosophy and even Hebrew wisdom had grown. This belief was not unreasonable given the texts themselves, which claim great antiquity and present themselves as revealed wisdom, and given the references in early Christian writers like Lactantius and Augustine, who seem to confirm that Hermes Trismegistus had prophesied Christian truths, the conclusion seemed obvious. Here was a parallel revelation, perhaps even the original revelation from which all others derived. The Hermetic texts spoke of the divine mind contemplating itself and producing the cosmos through that contemplation, of the Logos or divine word as the instrument of creation, of humanity as containing both divine and mortal natures, of the need for the soul to ascend through the planetary spheres, shedding the garments of passion and illusion until it could return to its source in pure intellect. These themes resonated powerfully with Renaissance humanists who were trying to reconcile classical philosophy with Christian doctrine, who were fascinated by the possibility that human beings might, through education and discipline, realize their divine potential, who saw in the recovery of ancient texts a path to cultural and spiritual renewal. Ficino himself was not merely a translator, but a practitioner. He composed hymns to be sung to the accompaniment of a lyre while burning specific incenses, timing these performances according to astrological configurations to draw down beneficial planetary influences. He used Hermetic principles to create what he called spiritual music, designed to tune the soul to celestial harmonies. His villa at Careggi outside Florence became a kind of informal academy where artists and poets and philosophers would gather to discuss Plato and the Hermetic texts, to experiment with musical and visual correspondences, to explore how beauty in art might serve as a vehicle for spiritual transformation. This was Hermeticism not as abstract theory, but as lived practice, integrated into daily life and creative work. Ficino's student Giovanni Pico della Mirandola took Hermetic ideas in a different direction. Pico was convinced that all wisdom traditions, Christian, Jewish, Islamic, Greek, Egyptian, contained fragments of a single original truth, and he set out to demonstrate this through his famous 900 Theses, which drew connections between Kabbalah and Hermeticism, between Christian theology and pagan mythology, seeking the common ground beneath apparent differences. Pico's oration on the dignity of man, one of the most celebrated texts of Renaissance humanism, is deeply Hermetic in spirit. It presents the human being as a creature of indeterminate nature, capable of sinking to the level of beasts or rising to the level of angels or even beyond, through the exercise of free will and the pursuit of wisdom. This is the Hermetic vision of man as microcosm, containing all possibilities, determining his own fate through his choices. The Hermetic revival spread rapidly through Europe, in Florence, in Rome, in Venice, where the Aldine Press published beautiful editions of ancient texts, in Paris, where scholars debated the relationship between magic and religion; in London, where John Dee would build one of the greatest libraries of Hermetic and alchemical manuscripts in Europe. Dee was both mathematician and mystic, astrologer to Queen Elizabeth, and experimenter with angelic communication. He saw no contradiction between his work on navigation and optics and his attempts to converse with angels through elaborate rituals involving crystal gazing and complex symbol systems. For him, as for many Renaissance scholars, natural philosophy and spiritual practice were aspects of a single quest to understand and work with the hidden structures of reality. The 16th century became a golden age for Hermetic practice. Alchemical laboratories proliferated, often funded by princes and nobles hoping to transmute base metals into gold, but serious alchemists understood their work in spiritual terms. The transmutation of metals was understood as a parallel or symbol for the transmutation of the soul, the purification of consciousness through the same processes of dissolution, separation, and recombination that were applied to material substances. The alchemical texts of this period are dense with symbolism, drawings of the hermaphrodite combining male and female, the green lion devouring the sun, the king and queen uniting in a chemical marriage, dragons and eagles and pelicans, each image encoding multiple levels of meaning, chemical operations, psychological transformations, cosmological principles. Heinrich Kunrath's Amphitheatrum Sapientiae Aeternae, published in 1609, presents spectacular engravings showing the alchemist's laboratory as a temple space, with musical instruments and books of sacred texts alongside furnaces and alembics, prayer and experiment equally essential to the great work. The harmonization of spirit and matter in the creation of the philosopher's stone. Giordano Bruno, perhaps the most radical of the Renaissance Hermeticists, took the implications of a Hermetic cosmology to their extreme. He proposed an infinite universe filled with countless worlds. He rejected the traditional hierarchy with Earth at the center. He saw divinity immanent in all things, an infinite creative power expressing itself through infinite forms. Bruno's vision was deeply threatening to both Catholic and Protestant authorities. He wandered through Europe, teaching his ideas, publishing provocative books, until finally in 1592 he was arrested by the Inquisition in Venice, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in Rome in 1600, refusing to recant his belief in the infinity of worlds and the universal presence of divine mind. His martyrdom marked a turning point. The Church was now actively hostile to Hermetic philosophy when it strayed too far from orthodox boundaries, and soon another blow would fall, this one intellectual rather than political, but equally devastating to Hermeticism's cultural authority. In 1614, the Protestant scholar Isaac Casaubon published a philological analysis of the Hermetic texts, using careful comparison of vocabulary and style. He demonstrated that the Corpus Hermeticum could not have been written in ancient Egypt, but must date from the early centuries of the Common Era, from the Hellenistic period or later. Casaubon's argument was sound. It was based on solid linguistic evidence, and it effectively destroyed the belief in the pristine antiquity of the Hermetic revelation. If these texts were not the ancient wisdom of Egyptian priests, but relatively late compositions influenced by Greek philosophy, then their authority was greatly diminished. They could no longer serve as an independent confirmation of Christian truth or as a source of pure pre-philosophical wisdom. The impact of Casaubon's critique was not immediate. Many scholars continued to value the Hermetic texts for their content, regardless of their date. But over the following century, as European thought moved toward rationalism and empiricism, as the scientific revolution transformed the study of nature, Hermeticism gradually lost its place in respectable intellectual discourse. Yet it did not disappear. It went underground into the proliferating secret societies and esoteric orders that would characterize the 17th and 18th centuries, into Rosicrucianism with its mystical Christianity blended with alchemy, into Freemasonry with its elaborate symbolic degrees and emphasis on spiritual transformation through ritual, into the countless private circles of seekers who continued to study the old texts, to practice the old arts, convinced that modern rationalism had discarded wisdom along with superstition. The 18th century was a curious time for Hermetic ideas, officially dismissed by the philosophes and scientists who were building the Enlightenment, yet thriving in the margins and shadows, finding new expression in movements that combined spiritual seeking with social reform. The Rosicrucian manifestos that had appeared in the early 1600s had sparked a wave of excitement and speculation, claiming the existence of a secret brotherhood of adepts who possessed ancient wisdom and the ability to heal the sick, to transmute metals, to read the book of nature. Though no one could find the actual Rosicrucians, the idea of such a brotherhood inspired countless imitators and claimants. Freemasonry emerged in this context, transforming from medieval stonemason guilds into a fraternal society with elaborate initiatory rituals. The Masonic degrees encoded Hermetic principles in symbolic form. The rough stone transformed into the perfect ashlar, representing the soul's refinement, the Temple of Solomon representing the cosmos and also the perfected human being, the various tools and emblems all pointing toward moral and spiritual lessons about transformation and enlightenment. The Freemasons attracted men from all levels of society, aristocrats and merchants, artists and scientists, all drawn by the promise of fellowship and the appeal of ancient mysteries. Lodges spread throughout Europe and across the Atlantic to the American colonies, creating networks of influence that would play roles in both the American and French revolutions. In Germany, a physician named Samuel Hahnemann was developing homeopathy, a medical system based on the principle that that substances which cause symptoms in healthy people can cure those same symptoms in the sick when administered in highly diluted doses. This was essentially a Hermetic principle of sympathy and correspondence applied to therapeutics. The idea that there are hidden relationships between substances and diseases that transcend material causation. Franz Anton Mesmer, around the same time, proposed the existence of a universal fluid or animal magnetism that pervaded all things and could be manipulated to produce healing. His theories were rejected by scientific commissions, but his practices, involving dramatic sessions where patients would experience convulsions and visions, attracted enormous popular interest and anticipated later discoveries about hypnosis and the power of suggestion. Both Hahnemann and Mesmer were drawing on Hermetic notions of invisible forces and correspondences, trying to translate ancient wisdom into modern therapeutic form. And though their theories were not accepted by mainstream medicine, They influenced the development of alternative healing traditions that persist to this day. The late 18th century also saw the flourishing of Illuminist movements, groups claiming direct contact with higher spiritual beings who would transmit wisdom and guidance. The most famous was the Order of the Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria, though it was actually a rationalist political society rather than a mystical order, but the name and the idea captured the imagination and spawned endless conspiracy theories and fictional elaborations. More genuinely, Hermetic were the teachings of Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, known as the unknown philosopher who wrote about the inner church, the spiritual temple that exists within each person, and about the path of reintegration by which the fallen soul could return to its divine source. His influence would extend into the 19th century through various mystical Christian movements. Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish scientist turned visionary, experienced a spiritual crisis in his 50s that led to years of systematic exploration of the spiritual world through visions and inner experiences. He described an elaborate cosmology of heavens and hells, of correspondences between the spiritual and natural realms, of degrees of being ascending from gross matter to pure divine love and wisdom. Swedenborg's writings were deeply influenced by Hermetic principles even as they were framed in Christian theological language. His doctrine of correspondences, that everything in the natural world corresponds to something in the spiritual world, is essentially the Hermetic axiom of as above, so below, and his insistence that true religion is about internal transformation rather than external observance echoes Hermetic emphasis on gnosis and regeneration. The 19th century brought new forms and new contexts for Hermetic thought, as European empires expanded and increased contact with Asian religions, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism. Seekers began to see connections between Hermetic ideas and Eastern philosophy, the notion of the divine self within, the cycles of emanation and return, the practices of meditation and visualization, the Theosophical Society founded by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky and Henry Steele Olcott in 1875 explicitly aimed to synthesize Western esotericism with Eastern wisdom. Blavatsky's massive works, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, drew on Hermetic sources alongside Buddhist and Hindu texts, Egyptian mythology and Kabbalistic symbolism, creating a grand narrative of cosmic evolution and human spiritual development. Blavatsky claimed to be in contact with hidden masters, Mahatmas who dwelt in Tibet and transmitted ancient teachings telepathically. Whether or not one accepts these claims, her work succeeded in making esoteric ideas accessible to a wide audience, and the Theosophical Society became a major vector for the transmission of Hermetic principles into modern spirituality. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in London in 1888 by William Wynne Westcott and Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, took a different approach, creating an elaborate system of initiatory grades based on the Kabbalistic tree of life, combining Hermetic magic with Christian mysticism, Egyptian symbolism, and ritual techniques drawn from grimoires and alchemical texts. The Golden Dawn synthesized centuries of Western esoteric practice into a coherent curriculum. Members learned astrology, tarot, alchemy, ritual magic, meditation techniques, all organized into a progressive path of training meant to develop spiritual faculties and eventually achieve conscious contact with the higher self, or holy guardian angel. Though the order itself fractured and dissolved within 2 decades due to personal conflicts among its leaders, its influence was enormous. Many of its members went on to become influential teachers and writers. Aleister Crowley, perhaps the most famous or infamous, developing his own system of thelema based on Golden Dawn foundations, but pushing its implications in more antinomian directions. Crowley's writings, particularly the Book of the Law, which he claimed was dictated to him by a discarnate intelligence in Cairo in 1904, presented a radical reinterpretation of Hermetic principles, emphasizing individual will as the fundamental cosmic force. "Do what thou wilt" shall be the whole of the law, a phrase that shocked conventional society, but which Crowley insisted meant finding and following one's true purpose, one's true will aligned with cosmic necessity. The early 20th century saw Hermetic ideas flowing into modern art movements. The symbolists and surrealists were fascinated by alchemical imagery and the idea of transforming consciousness through symbolic operations. Artists like Hilma af Klint and Wassily Kandinsky were influenced by theosophy and saw abstract painting as a way of making spiritual realities visible. Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology drew heavily on Hermetic and alchemical sources. Jung saw in the alchemical texts a symbolic vocabulary for describing processes of psychological integration, the union of opposites, the transformation of the personality through the encounter with unconscious contents. His concept of individuation, the process by which a person becomes their true self, is essentially a modern psychological rendering of the Hermetic quest for spiritual realization. Jung corresponded with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli about synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that could not be explained by causation, attempting to revive the Hermetic notion of a causal connections between psyche and matter. They speculated that quantum physics might provide a framework for understanding how consciousness and physical reality interpenetrate in ways that classical physics could not accommodate. After the Second World War, there was a resurgence of interest in esotericism, partly as a reaction against the horrors of mechanized warfare and totalitarian ideologies. People were seeking alternative frameworks, ways of thinking about human nature and cosmic order that emphasized spiritual values and the possibility of transformation. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 70s drew on Hermetic ideas often filtered through theosophy and the Golden Dawn tradition, the interest in astrology and tarot, in altered states of consciousness achieved through meditation or psychedelics, in Eastern spiritual practices transplanted to Western soil, all reflected Hermetic themes of correspondence, transformation, and the search for gnosis. Academic study of Western esotericism also began to emerge as a legitimate field during this period. Scholars like Francis Yates published groundbreaking works on Renaissance Hermeticism and its role in the development of modern science, arguing that figures like Copernicus and Newton were influenced by magical thinking and Hermetic cosmology, even as they were laying foundations for the scientific revolution. This scholarship challenged the simple narrative of progress from superstition to reason, showing instead how Hermetic ideas about natural magic and celestial influences motivated experimental investigation of nature, how the belief that nature contained hidden sympathies and correspondences encouraged careful observation and testing, how the alchemical quest to transform matter contributed to the development of chemistry. The late 20th century saw an explosion of popular books on Hermeticism. Translations of previously obscure texts became widely available. Publishers like Fanes Press and Inner Traditions made alchemical manuscripts and Renaissance magical texts accessible to general readers, and authors like Stephen Hiller and Richard Smoley wrote introductions to Hermetic philosophy for contemporary seekers. The Internet age has brought another transformation. Online communities discuss Hermetic texts and practices. Digital archives make rare manuscripts available to anyone with a connection. YouTube channels offer lectures on alchemy and astrology. Forums debate the interpretation of symbols and the effectiveness of rituals. Hermeticism has become democratized in ways that would have been unimaginable even 50 years ago. Contemporary practitioners might work with Hermetic principles in therapeutic contexts, using archetypal imagery in counseling or in creative practices, using alchemical symbolism as a framework for artistic process, or in spiritual seeking, drawing on Hermetic meditation techniques and philosophical concepts to develop a personal path of understanding. There are also those who attempt to reconstruct historical practices, recreating Renaissance talismanic magic or Golden Dawn rituals with careful attention to period sources, and those who innovate, blending Hermetic ideas with chaos magic or creating entirely new systems inspired by the Hermetic emphasis on correspondence and transformation. The question of what Hermeticism means in a modern scientific age remains open. For some, it is purely symbolic, a rich vocabulary for describing psychological and spiritual experiences that are real, even if the cosmology is outdated. For others, it represents an alternative paradigm, a way of knowing that complements scientific knowledge by attending to meaning and quality rather than quantity and mechanism. And perhaps this is fitting, because from its origins in Hellenistic Alexandria, Hermeticism has always been adaptive, absorbing new influences, taking new forms, speaking to each age in the language that age can hear. The texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus have survived not by remaining frozen in ancient forms, but by proving endlessly reinterpretable, endlessly applicable to new contexts and new questions. The river continues to flow, sometimes underground, sometimes visible and celebrated, sometimes dismissed and marginalized, but never entirely dry, because the fundamental questions it addresses remain vital. How do mind and matter relate? What is the nature of the human being in the cosmos? What kinds of knowledge and transformation are possible? And how might we live in alignment with the deeper patterns of reality? These questions take on new urgency in an age of ecological crisis and technological transformation, when the relationship between consciousness and the material world is being renegotiated, when ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science both grapple with the mystery of how observation affects reality, how intention influences outcome, how meaning emerges from matter, and so the deeper currents reveal themselves, the patterns that persist beneath the changing forms. What has remained constant through all these centuries of transformation and reinterpretation is perhaps not any specific doctrine or practice, but rather a way of seeing, a mode of attention that looks for connections, for resonances, for the hidden threads that link disparate phenomena into meaningful wholes. The Hermetic impulse is fundamentally poetic, not in the sense of writing verse, but in the older sense of poiesis, making, creating, participating in the ongoing creation of meaning. It sees the world not as a collection of dead objects governed by blind forces, but as a living text, a divine utterance still speaking, still inviting interpretation and response. This is why Hermeticism has always attracted artists and mystics alongside philosophers and scientists, because it treats knowledge not as mere information, but as transformation. What you truly know changes you, becomes part of you, and this integration of knower and known dissolves the sharp boundary between subject and object that modern thought takes for granted. The Hermetic practice of contemplating correspondences, noting how the same pattern appears in different domains, the branching of trees and rivers and blood vessels and lightning, the spiral in shells and galaxies and water going down a drain. This is not primitive confusion between unlike things, but recognition of morphological kinship, the same formal principle expressing itself at different scales and in different materials. Modern science has rediscovered some of these patterns under the name of fractals and scaling laws, finding mathematical regularities that govern phenomena from quantum fluctuations to the distribution of galaxies. And while the Hermetic astrologers may have been wrong about the mechanism by which planets influence earthly events, they were attending to real rhythms, real cycles, the way biological and psychological processes do indeed correlate with solar and lunar phases, with seasonal changes, with the long periodicities of planetary motion. The alchemists, too, for all their cryptic symbolism and failed attempts at material transmutation, were engaged in something profoundly important. They were exploring the phenomenology of transformation, watching closely as substances change color and consistency and behavior, noting the stages through which raw material must pass to become refined product, and recognizing in these processes a mirror of psychological and spiritual development. Jung's insight was to see that the alchemical sequence, negredo or blackening, albedo or whitening, citrinitas or yellowing, rubedo or reddening, described stages of individuation, the dark night of the soul when old structures dissolve, the clarification that follows, the dawning of new understanding, the integration that produces the gold of realized selfhood. Whether or not one accepts Jung's specific interpretations, his fundamental point remains valid, that the physical world and the psychological world are not separate realms, but different aspects of a single reality, and that attending carefully to material processes can illuminate spiritual ones, and vice versa. This is the Hermetic worldview in modern dress. The principle, as above, so below, often dismissed as meaningless mystification, actually encodes a sophisticated epistemological claim that we can know the transcendent through the immanent, the invisible through the visible, the macrocosm through the microcosm, because they share structure. They are variations on the same themes, and therefore analogy and correspondence are legitimate modes of knowing alongside analysis and measurement. Medieval scholars spoke of the Book of Nature as a second scripture, equal in authority to the written Bible, because both were authored by the same divine intelligence and therefore must ultimately harmonize. To read nature rightly was to glimpse divine intention, and this required not just empirical observation but also symbolic interpretation, seeing phenomena as signs, as meaningful communications from the mind that ordered the cosmos. This sacramental view of nature has largely been lost in modernity, where the natural world is treated as resource or mechanism rather than revelation, and perhaps this loss contributes to the ecological crisis. Because if nature is merely dead matter to be exploited, there is no reason for restraint beyond self-interest. But if nature is a sacred text, a living expression of divine creativity, then to damage it is not just imprudent, but impious, a failure to honor the source of our own being. Hermeticism offers one pathway back to enchantment, to seeing the world as alive and meaningful, not through rejecting scientific knowledge, but by embedding it in a larger framework that includes purpose and value, quality and significance, the how and the what, alongside the why and the wherefore. The Hermetic emphasis on personal transformation through knowledge also speaks to contemporary concerns in an age of information overload, where facts proliferate but wisdom remains scarce. The Hermetic insistence that true knowledge is gnosis, direct experiential realization that changes the knower, offers an alternative to mere accumulation of data. The path described in the Hermetic texts is not about learning doctrines, but about waking up, becoming conscious of what one actually already is beneath the layers of conditioning and distraction, the divine intellect that has always been present, but forgotten, covered over by identification with the body and its needs, with social roles and expectations, with the endless chatter of the discursive mind. This awakening is described not as achieving something new, but as remembering as the soul's return to its origin and the practices associated with it, meditation, contemplation of symbols, ritual enactment of cosmic dramas, are all designed to facilitate this remembering, to create conditions under which the deep self can emerge from beneath the surface self. And perhaps this is why Hermeticism continues to attract seekers in the modern world, because it offers a path of transformation that honors both intellect and imagination, that values reason without reducing everything to logic, that pursues spiritual realization without requiring adherence to fixed dogmas or institutional authorities. The Hermetic way is ultimately one of synthesis and integration, bringing together what modernity has split apart, mind and body, spirit and matter, reason and intuition, individual and cosmos, and in this integrative vision, there may be resources for addressing the fragmentation and alienation that characterize contemporary life. The journey through Hermetic history reveals not a single straight path, but a labyrinth, a complex meandering through many cultures and contexts, and yet certain themes recur like refrains in a long composition, the unity underlying diversity, the correspondence between levels of reality, the possibility of transformation, the marriage of opposites, the recovery of forgotten wholeness. These themes are not exclusively Hermetic. They appear in many wisdom traditions, but Hermeticism has been a particularly important carrier of them in Western culture, preserving through dark times ideas and practices that might otherwise have been lost, providing bridges between ancient and modern, Eastern and Western, esoteric and exoteric, and so the contemplation comes full circle, back to the beginning that was never really a beginning, because these ideas are older than their historical expressions. They emerge again and again because they touch something fundamental about human experience, about the relationship between consciousness and cosmos, about the longing to understand and the possibility of transformation. The texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus will continue to be read and reinterpreted, each generation finding in them reflections of its own concerns and intimations of truths not yet fully grasped. And this is as it should be, because Hermeticism has always been less about preserving ancient answers than about keeping ancient questions alive. Questions about the nature of the divine, about the human place in the cosmic order, about the relationship between matter and spirit, about what kinds of knowledge and transformation are possible. These questions cannot be permanently answered because they arise from the very structure of reflective consciousness. They are the mind contemplating itself and the world it inhabits, and finding in that contemplation both mystery and meaning. The long twilight has arrived, that time of gentle fading when the boundaries between day and night blur, when the urgent clarity of noon gives way to softer tones, more subtle gradations, and the mind settles into a different rhythm, less concerned with distinctions and definitions, more receptive to intimations and atmospheres. The story of Hermeticism is ultimately a human story about the perennial effort to make sense of existence, to find patterns in chaos, to glimpse order beneath apparent disorder, to believe that the universe is not indifferent to consciousness, but somehow speaks to it, invites understanding, rewards attention with insight. Whether the old cosmology is literally true matters less than whether it captures something experientially valid, whether it provides a useful map for navigating inner and outer terrain, whether it helps orient us toward what is genuinely valuable and away from what merely seems so. The symbols and practices that Hermetic traditions have elaborated over millennia are technologies of consciousness, ways of training attention, of opening perception, of facilitating experiences that are difficult to achieve through ordinary modes of awareness. And like all technologies, they can be used skillfully or clumsily, can serve wisdom or folly, can illuminate or obscure. What they offer, when approached with discrimination and genuine seeking, is a path of exploration, a way of engaging with the mystery of existence that is neither purely rational nor purely devotional, but something between and beyond, a way that honors both the transcendence and immanence of the sacred, both the distance and intimacy of the divine. The night deepens now, and the stars become visible, those ancient lights that have witnessed the entire human story, that saw the priests in Egyptian temples, the philosophers in Alexandria, the alchemists in their laboratories, the mystics in their cells, all looking upward and inward, seeking the connection between the cosmos without and the cosmos within. And perhaps this is the final gift of Hermetic thought, this invitation to pause and look and listen, to attend to the world with patience and reverence, to notice the patterns that repeat and the variations that make each moment unique, to hold together the eternal and the temporal, the universal and the particular. The words fade now like breath on glass, leaving only the faintest trace, a residue of meaning that dissolves even as it forms. And what remains is not any specific teaching, but a quality of attention, a way of being present to mystery without needing to resolve it, comfortable with paradox and ambiguity, trusting that understanding comes not from grasping, but from allowing, not from force, but from receptivity. The ancient wisdom speaks most clearly in silence, in the spaces between words where thought becomes contemplation, where questions float without demanding answers, where the mind releases its grip and discovers a different kind of knowing, wordless and immediate, direct and transforming. And so the journey comes to rest, not at a destination, but in a continuing, the river still flowing, the stars still turning, the question still alive in anyone who pauses long enough to wonder, to look up at the night sky and feel the ancient vertigo, the recognition that we are somehow both infinitesimal and infinite, dust and divinity, matter contemplating its own mystery. The voice grows quieter now, softer, until it is barely distinguishable from the general hush, and perhaps this too is fitting, because the deepest truths are whispered, are suggested rather than stated, are known in that twilight consciousness where logic loosens and imagination stirs and something older and wiser than the everyday mind begins to speak. Let the words dissolve like stars into dawn. Let the thoughts settle like silt after flood. Let the long story of Hermeticism, of human seeking and finding and seeking again, rest now in that space beyond speech, where all the questions meet all the silence, and meaning emerges not from answers, but from the quality of attention we bring to the great mystery of being here, being conscious, being able to wonder at all,